Hey legends! Welcome to Harryverse X. Buckle up for today's story. What if Arya Stark and Jon Snow rescued Harry age 5 and Valyrian dragon magic made him Dragon Lord? A like and subscribe goes a long way. Now let's jump in. Chapter 1, The Cupboard and the Cold. The gap between worlds didn't announce itself. There was no thunder, no column of light, no dramatic tearing of the sky. One moment Arya Stark was standing in a corridor that smelled of salt and old stone somewhere east of Braavos, and the next she was standing on a street so aggressively ordinary it made her teeth ache. Perfectly identical houses lined up on both sides like soldiers who'd forgotten what they were fighting for. Neat hedges. Matching letterboxes. A road so smooth it looked frightened of dirt. She had her hand on her knife before her eyes had finished adjusting. Jon was 2 steps behind her, and she heard him exhale, that specific exhale he had, the one that meant I have no idea where we are but I'm not going to say that out loud. Gate closed behind us, he said quietly, looking back over his shoulder at the perfectly empty air where they'd stepped through. I noticed. Arya, I noticed, Jon. He didn't push it. That was one of the things she'd learned to appreciate about him over the past 2 years of wandering through things that shouldn't have been possible. Jon Snow knew when to stop talking. The Valyrian gates had been doing this for months, pulling them sideways through places that felt wrong in a particular way, like music played in the right key but the wrong time signature. This place had that feeling. The magic here was old and buried and deeply, profoundly uncomfortable, like a word said so many times it had lost its meaning. The street was called Privet Drive. She could read it on the sign at the corner, the letters sharp and clean in a way that felt almost aggressive. The sky above it was the particular gray of November that had no interest in being anything else. Every house had its lights off except for the blue flicker of what she'd learned were called televisions. She'd seen them in other places they'd passed through, always showing people talking at each other without listening. Jon pulled his cloak tighter and started walking. We should find shelter before someone sees us, he said, his eyes moving the way they always moved, measuring, cataloging, checking for threats. Old Night's Watch habits. Old everything habits. Jon Snow had been trained to survive since before he could articulate what survival was. We should find the gate back first. The gate closed, Arya. Then we find a new gate. There's always a thread. She pressed her fingers against the air where they'd come through and felt nothing, which told her approximately nothing. The Valyrian magic that moved them didn't follow rules she'd fully mapped yet. It moved like water finding the lowest point, purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with what she wanted. She dropped her hand and turned to look at the street properly. That was when she heard it. It wasn't loud. That was what made her stop walking. Loud sounds on quiet streets were easy to dismiss, drunk men, angry neighbors, dogs. This was quiet in the way that small, contained things were quiet. A sound that had learned not to be heard because being heard had consequences. A child crying. She'd heard children cry before. She'd heard them cry in ways that broke her open, in ways that were just noise, and ways that meant nothing more than tiredness or hunger. This was none of those. This was the sound of a child crying with its face pressed into something so the sound wouldn't escape. The practiced silence of someone who'd learned that making noise was worse than swallowing it. She knew that sound. She'd made that sound herself, once, in a place she didn't think about. She was already moving before she'd consciously decided to move. Arya. Jon's voice was low, cautious. Shut up. She wasn't being sharp with him. She was being focused. She walked along the pavement with her head slightly tilted, tracking the sound the way Sirio had taught her to track a blade in the dark, by the displacement of air and the feeling of wrongness. It was coming from the third house on the left. Number 4, she noticed without caring. She stopped in front of it and looked at the house with the same expression she used for things she'd already decided to deal with. Jon came to stand beside her. She could feel him noticing what she'd noticed, or beginning to. He was good at this too, in his way. He'd spent years watching for threats in places that were almost entirely threats. He knew what wrongness felt like. "The crying," he said. "The crying," she agreed. "We don't know what we're walking into. We never do." She'd already unlatched the front gate. It opened without a sound, well-oiled, because this was the kind of house where everything was maintained so aggressively that not even the gate was allowed to squeak. The garden was ruthlessly symmetrical. There was a car in the driveway that cost more than some villages she'd passed through. The front door was locked, obviously, because this was the kind of house that was always locked. Arya studied it for approximately 2 seconds and then moved around the side. She wasn't going to pick the lock on a front door in full view of a street that, despite being apparently asleep, had the particular quality of places where people watched their neighbors out of habit. The side gate was bolted from the inside. She went over it in one smooth movement and landed in the back garden, which was as oppressively neat as the front. Jon dropped down beside her a beat later, quieter than she'd have expected from a man his size. Ghost had trained that into him. Years of following a dire wolf had made him quieter than he had any right to be. The back door was also locked. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Jon, then reached into her belt and took out the thin pick she'd learned to use in Bravos. 30 seconds later the door swung inward and she put the picks away and walked into a kitchen that smelled of bacon fat and furniture polish. It was an ordinary kitchen in the way that things became ordinary by being aggressively, determinedly so, as though someone had worked very hard to ensure that nothing here would ever surprise anyone. Everything was expensive, clean, and slightly too large. There were 3 chairs at the breakfast table. 3 mugs on the drying rack. 3 of everything, she realized, counting automatically. The crying was coming from the other side of the ground floor, but it wasn't. She stopped, reoriented. Below. Slightly below and to the right, which meant, Jon had already seen it. He was crouching in the hallway next to a door under the stairs, the kind of door that led to a cupboard where you stored coats and boxes and things you wanted to forget about. He had his hand flat against it, not touching the bolt yet, just feeling. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, somewhere between fury and something more careful than fury. "There's a bolt on the outside," he said. "I see it." A child-sized bolt on the outside of a cupboard under the stairs. "Jon." She said his name the way she said it when she needed him to not spiral, because Jon could spiral when children were involved, especially children in cupboards, especially. He slid the bolt back and opened the door. The smell hit her first. Old bedding and damp and something else, something that was just the smell of 2 small spaces occupied by something living. It was completely dark inside. She heard the crying stop immediately, not gradually, not with a trailing off, but the instantaneous silence of something that had learned to stop making noise the moment a door opened. Jon leaned in and looked, and then he was very still in the way he went still when he was working hard not to do something fast and final. Arya looked past his shoulder. The boy was in the far corner of the cupboard, pressed against the wall behind what appeared to be a small cot. He couldn't have been more than 5. He had dark hair that was an absolute disaster, and glasses, tiny glasses, one arm held on with what appeared to be tape, and he was wearing clothing approximately 4 sizes too large, a faded shirt that might once have been blue and trousers that had been rolled up at the ankles so many times the cuffs had developed their own personality. He had his knees pulled up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them, and he was staring at them with eyes that were the greenest things Arya had seen since she'd been somewhere green. He wasn't crying anymore. He was waiting. That was what got her, the waiting. He had the posture of something that had learned that what came through doors wasn't usually good, and so the best response was to make yourself small and wait for it to be over. Jon said nothing for a moment. Then he sat down on his heels, putting himself below the boy's eye level, which Arya recognized as something he'd learned from Ghost. "Don't loom. Don't threaten." "Hello," Jon said. The boy said nothing. His eyes moved from Jon to Arya and back to Jon. "My name is Jon. This is Arya." A pause. "What's your name?" The boy's mouth moved slightly. Then, very quietly, so quietly it was almost just a breath, "Harry." "Harry." John said it back like it was something worth saying. How long have you been in here, Harry? Harry's eyes moved to the door as though calculating something, and Arya realized he was checking whether whoever had put him here was coming back. The calculation of someone who'd learned that answering questions incorrectly had a price. Since dinner, Harry said. When was dinner? A pause. Yesterday. John's jaw tightened. Arya saw it because she was watching for it, and she watched it happen and then watched him smooth it back down into something that wouldn't frighten the child. Are you hungry? John asked. Something flickered in the boy's eyes, hope, maybe, or the more complicated thing that hope became when you'd hoped before and been wrong about it. He gave a tiny nod. John looked over his shoulder at Arya. She was already turning toward the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, vast, well-stocked, because the people who lived in this house ate well, and found bread and butter and cold chicken and a piece of cake that had clearly been cut from a larger cake and wrapped meticulously. She found a glass and filled it with water because that was fastest and most certain. She built a plate with the focused efficiency of someone who had fed herself in worse conditions and carried it back to the cupboard and handed it to John, who held it out toward Harry. Harry looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at John. It's not mine, he said. There was no tone in his voice when he said it. Just fact. It's not mine. As though eating food that wasn't designated specifically for him was simply a thing he'd learned not to do. Something cold moved through Arya's chest. It is now, she said. Harry looked at her. His glasses had slipped slightly, and he pushed them up with one finger in a gesture that was so automatic it had become invisible to him. Then he reached out and took a piece of the bread and began to eat it, carefully, methodically, like someone making sure to leave no evidence. John looked at Arya over the boy's head. She looked back. They had an entire conversation without speaking, the way they'd learned to in places where speaking was dangerous. How long has this been happening? Long enough that he apologized for eating. We're not leaving him here. Obviously not. John turned back to Harry, who had finished the bread and was looking at the chicken with an expression of wanting and waiting that was almost more painful than outright hunger would have been. Eat it, John said gently. All of it. Harry ate. While Harry ate, Arya listened to the house. She was good at that, listening to houses, to what they said and didn't say. This one said several things. It said someone large lived here, someone who took up space comfortably and didn't think about it. It said there was a child other than Harry. She could see, in the living room she passed, photos of a pink-faced blonde boy in what appeared to be every available school sport, wall to wall of him. It said that whatever rules applied here, they applied specifically and deliberately to one person. The 3 chairs at the table. The 3 mugs. The 3 of everything. She came back to the cupboard and crouched down next to John. 2 adults, she said quietly. 1 other child. The family that lives here. Harry had finished the chicken and was holding the piece of cake like he wasn't sure what to do with it. They give the cake to their own child, he told her, which wasn't a question or a complaint, just information. Just a fact he'd collected about the world he lived in. This is how things are. Eat the cake, Harry, Arya said. He ate the cake. A little faster this time, because she'd said it like it was already settled, the way she said most things. She didn't ask, she established. John found it irritating sometimes and Harry, apparently, found it reassuring. They waited while he ate. The house stayed quiet. Arya kept half her attention on the stairs, watching for the particular creak that meant someone was waking up and moving around, and the other half on the boy. He was strange. She didn't mean it unkindly. There was something around him. She noticed it in the same way she noticed magic when it was nearby, which she'd learned to do through years of proximity to things that shouldn't exist. There was a pressure to him, a sense of something compressed and waiting, like a fire that had been banked down very low but hadn't gone out. She'd felt something like it in the Valyrian ruins they'd passed through. The quality of potential. Of something that hadn't been allowed to be itself yet. She filed that away. When the plate was empty, Harry put it down carefully and looked at them both. "Are you going to put me back?" he asked. The question was asked with the same flat practicality as everything else he'd said. Not with despair, not with hope, just with the genuine inquiry of someone collecting data about his situation. As though being put back was the baseline assumption and anything else required active confirmation. John looked like he'd been hit. "No," he said. "We're not. Where are you taking me?" "We haven't decided yet," Arya said, which was true and which she said without apology because she didn't make promises she didn't know she could keep. "But not back in there. Not back to whoever put you in there." Harry considered this. "Then, my aunt and uncle." "Your aunt and uncle put you in a cupboard. When I do things wrong." "What did you do wrong?" A pause. His eyes went to the side in the specific way of someone remembering something that confused them. "I made Dudley's toy disappear. I didn't mean to. I was trying to give it back and then it just wasn't there." He looked at his hands. "That happens sometimes. Things happen and I didn't do them on purpose." John and Arya looked at each other again. "Magic," said the look. "Accidental magic," said the look back. "Young. Untrained. Being punished for it. Does it happen often?" John asked. "Aunt Petunia says I do it on purpose to be difficult." A very careful flatness in the way he said Aunt Petunia, the kind of flatness that meant he'd decided a long time ago what he thought about something and had learned to keep it somewhere no one could see it. "Do you?" Arya asked, just to hear him answer. "No." Direct. No hesitation. It was the first time she'd heard him say anything without a slight pause before it, as though every statement required checking before it left his mouth. Just no, fast and certain. He knew the truth of this one. He'd known it alone in the dark for long enough that no one could take it from him. She nodded. "We need to move," she said to John, because they'd been in the house long enough and the quality of the darkness outside the kitchen window was beginning to shift toward the particular gray that preceded dawn. "Now." John stood. He looked at Harry. "Can you walk for a bit?" Harry nodded and got up, and Arya noticed immediately that he did it in the automatic crouch of someone who'd learned that the ceiling of their sleeping space was low. He stretched up once he was out of the cupboard, just slightly, and she watched the tension in his small shoulders change as the space around him expanded. He had the plate in his hands. "Leave the plate," Arya said. He set it down on the hallway table. Then he stood there in his enormous shirt and his rolled-up trousers and looked up at them both and waited. John went to the kitchen and took 2 bread rolls from the bread box and wrapped them in a cloth and put them in his pack because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving anywhere without thinking about the next meal. Arya moved to the front door and checked the street through the narrow window beside it. Still empty. Still gray. She opened the door. That was when she heard the sound from upstairs. Not footsteps, something else. A creak, and then another creak, and then the unmistakable deep exhale of someone very large repositioning in a bed. They went out the front door. She pulled it shut behind them with a click that she managed to make almost entirely silent. The cold hit them immediately, properly cold, the kind that had intent. Harry didn't make a sound about it, which told her he was used to this too, that cold was another thing he'd learned to simply absorb. John pulled his cloak off and wrapped it around the boy in a single movement without stopping walking, and Harry disappeared into it almost entirely, only his face and his green eyes and his disastrous hair visible above the wool. They were halfway down the front path when the upstairs window slammed open. "Oi!" The voice was enormous. It matched, Arya thought without turning around, the impression she'd built from the house, something that had always taken up more space than it needed to and had never been asked to reconsider this. She heard Harry stop walking. "Keep walking," she said, and Harry kept walking. "Oi, what do you think you're doing with that boy?" She turned around then, because running from something when you didn't need to run established the wrong precedent. She turned around and looked up at the first-floor window and looked at the man leaning out of it. He was enormous in the way that certain men were enormous, not muscular, not dangerous, but large with the accumulated certainty of someone who had never once in his life been told no effectively. Red-faced, heavy-jowled, wearing pajamas that somehow managed to look both expensive and stupid. He was staring at her with the expression of someone who expected the universe to rearrange itself in response to his displeasure. "Step away from the boy," he said, pointing at her with a thick finger. "I'll call the police, I will. Bloody, whatever you are, you can't just walk into a man's house in the middle of the night and..." "Quiet," Arya said. It wasn't loud. It was just, final. The way certain words were when they were spoken by people who meant them completely. He stopped. Not because he was frightened, necessarily, but because he was startled. He'd expected argument or running or apology, not that single flat word delivered in that particular tone. He started again almost immediately. "Now look here, you." John had come to stand beside her. He was looking up at the window with the expression Arya privately called the wall face, the expression John had learned north of the wall, the one that said he had stood in front of things that would have eaten this man for breakfast and hadn't looked away. He said nothing. He simply looked. The man's voice didn't exactly die, but it changed quality. Became slightly less certain of itself. "That boy is my nephew," he said, though with less volume now. "He belongs in this house. I don't know who you think you are or how you got in. His name is Harry," John said. "He spent last night in a cupboard under your stairs." He's a problem child, he's always doing. "His name is Harry," John said again, "and he spent last night in a cupboard under your stairs because you put him there, and before that he spent, how many nights, Harry?" He looked at the boy. Harry had appeared from behind Arya, the cloak pulled around him, looking up at his uncle with the specific expression of a child who has decided to watch very carefully what is going to happen. "Lots," Harry said. Vernon Dursley's face went through several colors that Arya found moderately impressive. He leaned further out the window, and she registered the moment he decided to reframe this, the way people like him always reframe things, moving the argument to ground they were more comfortable with. "This is breaking and entering," he said. "I'll have you arrested. You're criminals. You walked into my home, your front door doesn't pick itself," Arya agreed pleasantly. "And your bolt doesn't throw itself from the outside. And that cupboard didn't furnish itself with a child's cot." She paused. "I'm going to ask you to do something. Shut the window. Go back to bed. Don't call anyone. And think very carefully about whether you'd like anyone to look closely at what your bolt on that cupboard door has been doing." Silence. "He has a scar," Arya said, and she wasn't sure why she said it because she'd only glimpsed it, a mark on Harry's forehead, lightning-shaped, partly hidden by his fallen hair, but something in her had clocked it as significant without being able to say why. A rather noticeable scar. On a very small child. I wonder what people would think about that. Vernon Dursley's face had gone from red to a purple-gray that was genuinely concerning from a medical standpoint. "Furthermore," she said, "if I hear that window open again in the next 10 minutes, I'll come back, and I'll be less interested in talking." She smiled. It was the smile she'd developed over years of learning to mean things completely. "Good night." She turned and walked. Harry fell into step beside her, having to take 2 steps for every one of hers. John came alongside her on the other side and they moved down Privet Drive in the pre-dawn gray like they'd always been going somewhere, and this was simply the direction. Behind them, after a moment, the window shut. They walked. Harry kept pace with them without complaint, which told her more about his endurance than any question would have. The street ended and fed into another street and then into something broader, leading toward what appeared to be a small park. The sky was beginning to lighten in its grudging November way, more dimming the darkness than introducing light. Arya took them to the park and they sat on a bench, Harry between them, wrapped in John's cloak. The bread rolls came out of John's pack. Harry ate half of one carefully and held the other half like he was deciding whether he was allowed to finish it. "Finish it," John said. Harry finished it. "Where are we going?" Harry asked. "We're figuring that out," John told him. "Is there magic where you're going?" Both of them looked at him. He looked back, perfectly steady. "There's magic around you," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't the observation of a child who'd read about such things, it was a simple statement of perception, the way he might say your cloak is dark or your sword is long. He saw it and said what he saw. "I can't always see it. But sometimes I can. It's different around you than around my aunt and uncle's neighbors." "What does it look like?" Arya asked. Harry considered. "Old. Like old fire." He looked at her. "You have a name. On you. Like something's written on you that I can't quite read." He frowned slightly, as though trying to bring something into focus. "Both of you." Arya felt the back of her neck tighten. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of things that mattered more than they appeared to, that this child was describing Valyrian marks, the residual burn that the gates left on people who traveled through them regularly. She'd had it confirmed to her once by a woman in Essos who read such things. She hadn't thought it was visible to anyone who hadn't been trained. "Yes," she said. "There's magic where we're going." "Probably." "Good," Harry said, with no inflection, and then looked out at the lightning sky with the expression of someone for whom this was simply the next piece of information. John looked at Arya. She looked at him. "We need to talk about the gate," John said. "I know. We can't take him through a Valyrian gate. We don't know where it'll put us. The gates have been consistent. They put us where the magic is. And they've been pulling here for the last 3, she stopped. Looked at Harry. Looked back at John. "They've been pulling here for weeks," she said more carefully. "I thought it was the burial sites. The old places. Maybe it wasn't the burial sites." She looked at Harry again. The way she'd looked at things before, calculating and certain. He looked back at her without self-consciousness. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "The gate will open again near an old site. There's one, I felt it when we arrived. North. Probably a day's travel." "How do we travel?" "We don't have money," she said. "I have money." She did, in various denominations and forms of various worlds and times they'd moved through, some of it gold and some of it silver and some of it the paper rectangles that this particular world seemed to use. She'd taken a handful of them from the Dursley's kitchen, from the pot on the counter, which she'd felt entirely fine about. "We'll manage." "We always manage," John agreed, which was true and also faintly ridiculous, and they both knew it. Harry had been listening to this whole exchange with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the conversations happening around you contained information about your immediate future and were therefore worth tracking. When they'd finished he said, "I don't have anything." "You don't need anything," John said. "We have what you need." "I don't have clothes that fit." Arya looked at his rolled-up trousers and nodded acknowledgement of this. "We'll sort that." "My glasses are broken." He pointed to the taped arm. "We'll sort that too." "I don't have, my school says you need a guardian." "A proper one." "To enroll." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with those green eyes behind the broken glasses, matter of fact, practical, not asking for anything, just listing facts he thought might be relevant. He'd been doing this all night, presenting information clearly, without emotional loading, like a small careful scribe making sure the account was accurate. "All right," she said. "We'll sort all of it." She said it the way she said things when they were settled, and Harry looked at her for a moment and then nodded in the same way he'd nodded when she told him to eat the cake, as though she'd said something he'd decided to believe, and was moving on. The park was lightening around them. Somewhere above the clouds the sun was making its grudging November effort. A bird did something in a distant tree. Harry's eyes had gone heavy, the way children's eyes went when they'd been awake all night and adrenaline was finished with them, and he was fighting it with the practiced will of someone who'd learned that sleeping made you vulnerable. "Sleep," John said. "We've got you." Harry looked at him. "I've got you," John said again, and there was something in his voice that wasn't just reassurance, it was a decision, the kind of decision John made quietly and then never revisited. He'd made it somewhere between the bolt on the cupboard door and the window slamming open. Arya had seen him make decisions like this before. They were always the ones that stuck. Harry looked at him for another 3 seconds, assessing. Then he leaned sideways and closed his eyes, and was asleep against John's arm in the time it took Arya to exhale. John looked at the boy. He didn't say anything. He just looked, with the expression of someone reckoning with the distance between the world as it should be and the world as it was. "John," Arya said softly. "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything." "Yes, you were." She was. She was going to say that they didn't know what they were doing, that they'd never planned for a child, that the Valyrian gates were unpredictable and dangerous and not something you dragged a 5-year-old through. She was going to say that this was complicated and that she didn't know anything about raising anyone. She was going to say all of that, and she looked at Harry, asleep now, really asleep, the tight vigilance of his waking face smoothed into something that was just a child's face, just a kid who needed to not be in a cupboard, and she decided against it. "We'll need to find warmer clothes," she said instead. "Yes. And the glasses fixed." "Yes. And we should figure out what kind of magic this world uses before we walk into anything." "Yes." A pause. "Arya." "What?" He said, "There's magic around us that looks like old fire." John looked at the horizon, where the November dawn was making its slow gray arrival. "Valyrian fire." "I know." And he could see it. Just, see it. Without training. Without being told to look. "I know." John was quiet. Then, "When the gate brought us here, of all the places it could have, I know," she said, for the 3rd time, and meant something different by it each time, which was the advantage of short phrases. "I know." She looked at Harry's face, the lightning scar, the dark bird's nest hair, the broken glasses held together with tape. She thought about the pressure she'd felt around him, the banked fire quality, the way the air near him had the particular hum of things that were more than they appeared. She thought about the Valyrian gate. About how it moved toward old power like water toward a drain. About how it had been pulling toward this city, this street, for weeks. Not toward the burial sites. Toward here. She thought about a boy who'd been sleeping in a cupboard, who apologized for eating food that wasn't his, who had asked, "Are you going to put me back?" without any expectation that the answer would be no. She thought about the word purpose. About how she'd been carrying a list for years and whether the list was the only version of it. Above the park, through the clouds, the November sun made one more effort and managed a thin cold light that reached the bench where they sat. Harry didn't stir. John's arm was around him. Arya sat on his other side and watched the light arrive and thought about gates and fire and choices and what it meant when the world moved you somewhere specific on purpose. Then she stopped thinking about it and just let it be what it was. A cold morning in a strange city with a child between them, and nowhere to be, and everything to do. She could work with that. She'd worked with less. Chapter 2, Fire remembers they left London on a bus. This was John's idea, and Arya initially objected on the grounds that buses were slow and visible and full of people who asked questions, and John's counter-argument was that Harry needed sleep and warmth and that a moving vehicle provided both without requiring them to explain themselves to anyone. She'd looked at the boy still wrapped in John's cloak, dead asleep on the park bench with his broken glasses slightly askew, and conceded the point without saying so out loud, which John understood to mean she agreed. The bus station was a 20-minute walk from the park. Harry woke up partway through it, oriented himself in about 4 seconds. She noticed this, the speed of it, the lack of the confused blinking most children did coming out of sleep, and fell into step between them without a word. He'd slept maybe 2 hours. He looked better for it. Not rested, exactly, but less scrape-draw around the edges. They bought tickets north with the paper money from the Desley's kitchen pot. The woman at the counter looked at them, a girl with a knife-shaped quality to her face, a young man with dark eyes and an old-world way of standing, a small boy in clothing 3 sizes wrong, and opened her mouth to say something, then apparently decided against it. People often decided against things when Arya looked at them in a certain way. It wasn't a threatening look. It was just a look that suggested the person on the receiving end should consider whether their next words were actually necessary. Harry looked at everything on the way to the station with the focused curiosity of someone who had been given very limited access to the world and intended to make up for lost time. He didn't ask questions out loud, he just looked, turning his head to track cars and storefronts and a group of pigeons that were having a disagreement over something, and filed it all away with the silent efficiency that was becoming his recognizable mode of engaging with new information. On the bus, he sat between them again and watched the city give way to motorway give way to the slowly widening countryside, and at some point looked up at John and said, "Where are we going exactly?" "Scotland," John said. Harry considered this. "Is that far?" "Far enough." "What's in Scotland?" Arya answered because John was watching the other passengers with his peripheral vision, which was his version of relaxing. "A place we need to find. Old ground. The kind that remembers things." Harry turned this over. "Like a grave? Like a foundation. The part that's left when everything built on top of it falls down." He nodded as though this was a satisfying clarification and turned back to the window. They stopped twice. Once at a services station where John bought sandwiches and a bottle of water and a pair of children's tracksuit trousers that were close enough to Harry's size from a rack near the entrance, and Harry changed in the bus station bathroom and came out looking marginally less like he was wearing someone else's life. Once in a town whose name Arya didn't catch where they had to change buses and wait 40 minutes on a bench outside a chip shop, and Harry ate chips with the focused reverence of someone experiencing them for what might have been the first time, or at least the first time without condition attached. "Do you like them?" John asked. "Yes." No hesitation. The same directness he'd used when she'd asked if he made the magic happen on purpose. He knew what he thought about chips. "Good." John ate his own. "Remember what they taste like. We won't always have them." Harry looked at him. "Where we're going doesn't have chips. Where we're going changes. We move around a lot." "Oh." A pause. "Do you always move around a lot?" "For the past 2 years, yes." "Why?" John looked at Arya. She looked back in a way that said, "Your story, your call." He looked at Harry and chose honesty with the particular precision of someone who'd learned that children sensed vagueness and mistrusted it. "We came from somewhere else," John said. "A different place. We got pulled through a kind of door, a magical one, and we've been trying to understand how it works ever since. It keeps moving us. We keep following." Harry ate a chip. "Has it moved you somewhere bad?" "Sometimes." "Has it moved you somewhere good?" John looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "Last night." Harry looked at his chips. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. He ate another chip. Arya watched this exchange and felt something she recognized after a moment as relief, which surprised her. She hadn't realized she'd been waiting to see whether John would be good at this. She should have known better. John had always been better at warmth than she was. It came from the same place as his tendency to shoulder other people's pain, which was sometimes a liability and sometimes precisely what was needed. She was good at protection. John was good at making things feel safe. Between them, she thought, they covered the territory. She stopped thinking about it and finished her chips. The second bus deposited them in a town at the edge of the highlands as the afternoon light was going golden and thin. The mountains were beginning in earnest to the north, rising out of the flatter ground with the unhurried authority of things that had been there long before anyone arrived to observe them. The air had changed, sharper, cleaner, carrying the particular cold of altitude and distance from cities. Harry breathed it in and something in his posture changed. It was subtle, a slight opening of the shoulders, a tilt of the chin upward. Like a window being unlatched. Arya felt the pull. She'd been feeling it since they'd gotten off the first bus, a directional pressure, not dramatic, just consistent, like a hand flat between her shoulder blades angled north and slightly east. The Valyrian magic, or what remained of it in this world's bones, pulling them the way it always pulled. She'd learned to follow it because fighting it was pointless and because it had, broadly, not killed them yet. "This way," she said, and started walking. Jon followed without question. Harry followed at his side, taking in the mountains with the expression of someone encountering the concept of scale for the first time. They walked for the better part of an hour, following a road that became a track that became something that might once have been a track but had decided not to commit to the description. The land rose and the grass thickened and the sky above them went from pale gold to the deep bruised blue of a highland evening. Harry asked 3 questions the entire time, whether there were wolves here, whether the mountains had names, and whether the thing Jon wore on his belt was a real sword. The answers were not anymore, most of them yes, and yes. He filed all 3 answers in the same quiet internal way and kept walking. The ruin announced itself not with any dramatic visual indicator, it was too well buried for that, but with a feeling. Arya had learned to recognize the feeling of Valyrian marked ground. It sat differently under your feet, slightly more present than ordinary ground, like the difference between a floor and a stage. She stopped walking and looked at what appeared to be a hillside with unusual stone formations partway up it, the kind that could be natural and wasn't. "There," she said. Jon looked. "I don't see the stones. The formation at 2 o'clock from the split boulder." He found it. "That's a ruin. What's left of one? Most of it's under the ground." "How old?" "Very." She was already walking toward it, and they followed. The entrance, such as it was a gap between 2 stones that had fallen against each other to form a rough arch. It was entirely unremarkable unless you knew what you were looking for, and Arya had spent long enough around Valyrian remnants to know that this was deliberate. They hid themselves in the mundane. She ducked through the arch and the world shifted quality immediately, the way it always did in these places, the air becoming slightly more aware of itself. Inside, the ruin went down. Steps cut into the rock, worn smooth by use so old the memory of it had been forgotten, leading into a chamber below ground level. The light followed them down in a way that light technically shouldn't, not dimming as it should in an enclosed underground space, but somehow sustaining itself, the pale blue-gray quality of a sky that wasn't there. Harry went through the arch and stopped. He stood very still. She turned back to look at him. He was standing with both feet on the top step, and his eyes had gone wide behind the cracked glasses in a way that wasn't fear and wasn't excitement but was something that included both and transcended them. He was staring into the chamber below like a person staring at something they'd been looking for without knowing they were looking. "Come on," Arya said. "Can you feel that?" he said. "Yes. Come on." He came down the steps. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, the walls fitted stone that had been placed with care so deliberate it had survived whatever years had passed above it. The floor was smooth. In the center of it was a plinth, that was the only word for it, a low raised platform of stone, and on the plinth was a Valyrian glyph so deeply carved it had survived everything time had thrown at it. Arya recognized the glyph. She'd seen it before, in 3 other ruins they'd moved through. It meant something close to remember or endure. The Valyrian word had layers that didn't collapse into a single translation. The chamber smelled of old fire. Not smoke, not burning, the deeper smell that fire left in stone it had touched enough times to change the stone's nature. The smell of heat remembered. Jon walked to the walls and touched one, reading the surface with his fingers the way people read things they couldn't quite see. Arya moved to the center and studied the glyph, not touching it yet, just orienting. Harry walked past both of them. He walked to the far wall, which was the only part of the chamber that wasn't carved stone. It was rock face, the living stone of the hillside, and it was slightly different from the rest. Warmer. She'd noticed it peripherally and flagged it for later examination. Harry walked straight to it with the focused intention of someone who hadn't decided to do this and was simply doing it, the same way she sometimes moved through a room with her knife drawn before she'd consciously registered the threat. He put his hand on the rock face. The chamber changed. Not dramatically, she wasn't going to overclaim the drama of it. The light shifted its quality. The air made a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a change in pressure, like a breath drawn and held. The smell of old fire intensified and then transformed, becoming something cleaner and more present, and the glyph on the central plinth warmed from pale carved stone to a faint deep red, the color of embers. Harry stood with his hand on the wall and his eyes wide and entirely unsurprised, as though this was something he'd been waiting to happen without knowing he was waiting. Then the rock face moved. A section of it, roughly circular, depressed inward and slid sideways with a grinding that sounded less like mechanism and more like intention, like something that had been waiting for the correct prompt and had now received it. Behind it was a niche, maybe 2 feet deep, carved into the living rock. And in the niche, on a natural shelf of stone, was an egg. It was the size of a large cantaloupe. It was black, not matte black, not painted black, but the kind of black that had depth to it, that caught light and held it inside rather than reflecting it. Across its surface, in patterns that followed some internal logic rather than any external symmetry, ran veins of deep gold that pulsed, very slowly, like a heartbeat. Not glowing, it wasn't glowing. Just present. Just alive in the specific way that very old sleeping things were alive. Arya's heart did something significant in her chest. Jon had gone completely still behind her. She didn't need to look at him to know his expression. Harry stood with his hand on the wall beside the niche and looked at the egg. The egg, objectively, could not look back at him. And yet the quality of the space between them had the character of mutual recognition, two things that had been pointing toward each other for a long time and had finally arrived at the same place. Harry, Jon said carefully. Don't. Harry picked up the egg. It happened with the natural ease of someone picking up something that belonged to them. He reached in with both hands and lifted it, and it settled against his chest in the cradle of his arms, and the veins of gold across its surface intensified briefly, not a flash, not a burst, just a deepening, like a flame when you feed it, and then settled into their slow pulse, slightly faster now. Slightly more awake. The warmth came off it visibly. In the cold air of the underground chamber, the heat shimmered above it like a summer road. Harry looked down at it. Then up at Arya. It's warm, he said. I can see that. What is it? She looked at Jon. Jon looked at her with an expression that said he absolutely knew what it was and was taking a moment to accept that this was now their life. A dragon egg, Arya said. Harry looked back at the egg. A real one. A real one. He was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of it through his palms. The pulse of the gold veins had settled into something regular, something almost rhythmic. Is it alive? The ones that are still warm are. She walked toward him slowly, not wanting to startle anything, the egg, or whatever the chamber was doing, or the something in Harry that had triggered all of this. She stopped 3 feet away and looked at the egg closely. The gold veins. The quality of the black. I've seen these before. In ruins. There were 12 of them, across the sites we've moved through. All cold. She met his eyes. All cold until now. Harry looked down at the egg again. Why is this one warm? He asked. Because of you, she thought. Because you walked into this room and put your hand on that wall and something in you and something in that egg recognized each other across however many thousands of years of sleeping and said yes, this one, here. Because the gates have been dragging us toward you for weeks and this is apparently why. We'll figure that out, she said, which was true and less overwhelming. They didn't stay in the chamber long after that. Arya took one careful look around the rest of the space, read the glyphs she could, made a note of two she didn't recognize. Jon checked the steps and the entrance, old habit, always knowing the exit. Harry stood in the middle of it all with the dragon egg held against his chest, turning slowly to look at the walls, and the gold veins kept their steady pulse, and the old fire smell was as strong as it had been when they first entered. When they climbed back out into the evening air, the sky had gone dark purple and the first stars were hard and bright. Harry tilted his head back and looked at them for a moment. The egg was tucked inside Jon's cloak, which Harry was still wearing, cradled in the fabric and held against his chest. "It's heavier than it looks," Harry said, adjusting his grip. "Most things are," Jon said. They made camp in the shelter of a stone wall about half a mile from the ruin, the remnant of a sheep enclosure, long abandoned. Jon built a fire with the efficiency of someone who had done it in worse conditions than this, and they ate what was left of the food from the bus station, which wasn't much, supplemented by hard bread from Jon's pack and the kind of dried meat that tasted like it had given up the will to be appetizing but contained the necessary calories to continue existing. Harry ate without complaint. He sat close to the fire with the egg on his lap, turned so the warmth of the fire met it. He watched the flames with the same focus quality he brought to everything, like fire was a text he was reading rather than a phenomenon he was observing. "How does the magic work?" he asked, not to either of them specifically, more to the general air between them. "My magic. The kind that makes things happen." Arya poked the fire. "How does yours feel when it happens?" He thought about it seriously. "Like pressure. Like when you hold your breath for too long and then it comes out wrong. A pause. Like it was going to happen whether I wanted it to or not. That's accidental magic. Young magic. Untrained." She set the stick down. "You haven't had anyone to teach you what to do with it. My aunt and uncle said it wasn't real." "Your aunt and uncle are wrong." He received this without visible emotion, which told her he'd already privately concluded the same thing and simply hadn't had external confirmation before. "What happens when you train it? You choose it. It stops happening to you and starts happening because you decide." He considered this like it was the most interesting thing anyone had said to him, which she thought it probably was. "Can you do magic?" "Not your kind." "Different kind." "What kind do you do?" She looked at her hands. The Valyrian marks the gates had put on her weren't visible to anyone without his specific sight, but she'd felt them change as they traveled, felt them settle into something like capacity. She'd used it twice, once to open a lock that shouldn't have opened, once to call fire in a rainstorm when they'd needed it badly. She didn't fully understand her own version of it yet. "Old magic," she said. "I'll figure it out eventually." "You don't know how yours works either." "No." He seemed to find this comforting rather than unsettling. She understood why, it put them on equal footing. Neither of them had all the answers. He wasn't behind, they were all in the same condition of figuring it out as they went. Jon had been quiet through all of this in the way he got quiet when he was thinking through something he wasn't ready to say. She knew the rhythm of it. He'd get there eventually. He got there. "There are schools," Jon said. "For magic. In this world. I've heard of them, when we've passed through the magical parts of the cities. People talked about them. A place called," he frowned, reaching for it. "Hogwarts." Harry looked up sharply. It was the first time he'd looked startled since the ruin. "I've heard that word," he said. "My aunt." She said it once and then went very white and said it was nonsense. And then she didn't say it again. "Your aunt knows about magic," Arya said. "She knows about magic and she pretended not to," Jon confirmed. "Which means she knows about you." He paused. "Which means people know about you, Harry. The magical people in this world. They know who you are." Harry looked at him steadily. "Why?" Jon hesitated. Arya didn't rescue him because she wanted to hear him navigate this. How much to say, how much a 5-year-old needed to know about himself right now when he'd just had the biggest night of his life. "We don't know everything yet," Jon said. "But you're not ordinary. Even by magical standards." The egg, he looked at the egg on Harry's lap, still pulsing gently. "Normal children don't walk into Valyrian ruins and wake up dragon eggs that have been cold for thousands of years." "Am I going to school?" Harry asked. The question was so practical, so immediate, that both of them almost laughed. Arya felt the laugh come and go and turned it into something more useful. "Not that school," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending." "Depending on what?" "On what they want from you." She said it honestly. People who know about special children have a habit of wanting things from them. "We need to understand what this world wants before we walk you into the middle of it." Harry looked at the fire. He didn't look frightened. She searched for the right word, calculating. Like he'd already absorbed the concept that the world wanted things from him and was now simply adding this to a pre-existing file. "My aunt once said I was her burden," he said, conversationally, watching the flames. And then a man came to the house. Tall man. Old. He had a very long thing. Like a staff but different. He touched his forehead, the scar, without seeming to notice he was doing it. He looked at me through the window. I saw him from the cupboard. And then he went away and my aunt never said I was a burden again, but she never said I wasn't one either." He paused. "I think the tall man wanted her to keep me." Arya and Jon went absolutely still. "When was this?" Arya asked. "When I was small," Harry said, which, given that he was currently 5, required some qualification. "Smaller. I don't remember it very well. It was right after I came to live with them." Arya kept her voice level. "Did the tall man have long silver hair?" Harry looked at her in mild surprise. "Yes. Half-moon glasses?" "I think so." She looked at Jon. Jon looked at her. "He's watching the boy," Jon said quietly. "Has been since he was placed there," Arya agreed. "Placed deliberately." The bolt on the outside, Petunia knowing about magic and staying quiet, the man checking in, Harry wasn't left there by accident. Harry was put there on purpose. Jon's jaw was doing the thing again. She watched him manage it. "Someone put this child in a cupboard," he said, "on purpose. Someone made a plan," she said carefully, "that required Harry to be somewhere specific, shaped in a specific way, by people who would." She stopped. Looked at Harry, who was listening to all of this with the same attention he brought to everything. She decided honesty continued to be the policy. People who would diminish him, she finished. Make him small. Make him believe he was less than he was. Harry was looking at the fire again. His hands on the egg were steady. "Why would someone want that?" he asked. Neither of them answered immediately. "Power," Jon said eventually. "People who want to control something powerful need to believe they can control it. The best way to control something is to make sure it doesn't believe in itself." He said it plainly, without additional weight, the way he said difficult true things. "If you'd grown up knowing what you were, what am I?" Jon looked at him. Really looked at him, in the firelight, with the egg pulsing gold on his lap and the ruin behind them and the stars above and this whole improbable night assembled around them. "We're going to find out," he said. "Together." "Together," Harry said, trying the word. "Yes." A long pause. Then Harry looked down at the egg. "I want to name it," he said. "It hasn't hatched yet," Arya said. "I still want to name it." "What do you want to name it?" He thought about it with his whole face, the way children thought about important decisions. Then he looked at Arya, and then at Jon, and something in his expression was the most deliberate thing she'd seen from him yet. "Nymeria's ghost," he said. She went very still. "What?" Jon said. Nymeria, Harry said, for, he pointed at Arya with a small finger. You feel like a Nymeria. And ghost, he pointed at Jon. For you. Because you feel like a ghost. He said it without self-consciousness, without the awareness that this should mean something specific to the two people he was naming the dragon for, because he didn't know. He was working from pure instinct, from the same place that had walked him across that chamber to put his hand on the wall. It's a good name, he added, with a certainty that closed the discussion. Arya looked at Jon. Jon's expression was the kind of expression she only saw on him when something had moved something in him that he kept carefully maintained. He cleared his throat. It's a good name, he agreed. The fire settled. The egg pulsed. Harry yawned with the immensity of a child who had been awake for too long and had processed too much and was now finished for the day whether he liked it or not. He lay down without being told, curled on his side with the egg held against his chest, Jon's cloak over him, and was asleep in minutes. The fire went on. Arya and Jon sat across it from each other. Someone built a prison for him, Jon said quietly. Yes. And expected him to stay in it. Yes. She poked the fire. They didn't account for Valyrian gates. Jon almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to full smile but it traveled in that direction. He looked at Harry, the small dark-haired shape wrapped in his cloak, the egg cradled in his arms, the gold veins still pulsing in the firelight. He named it for us, Jon said. He did. Without knowing. That's what makes it mean something. Jon was quiet again. The kind of quiet that was him processing something he couldn't yet put into a sentence. Eventually he'd find the sentence, or he wouldn't, and either way was fine with her. We're going to need to know more, she said. About this world. About what they know about him. About whoever the tall man is and what he's planning. She paused. And we're going to need to be very careful about how much of that information we let reach us versus how much we go looking for. You think he'll come looking? The gates aren't subtle. We walked into a Valyrian ruin and woke a dragon egg. In Scotland. She gave him a look. Someone noticed. Then we move in the morning. We move in the morning, she agreed. She took first watch, which was her preference, because she thought better in the dark when everything was quiet. She sat with her knife across her knees and her back to the stone wall and watched the fire and listened to the open dark around them. It was cold and it was quiet and the stars above the highlands were extraordinary. Harry slept with the deep unguarded sleep of someone who had decided, on some level below consciousness, that tonight he did not need to be on guard. The egg in his arms pulsed its slow gold pulse. Once, just once, something in the darkness to the north made a sound, something large and brief and gone, and Arya was on her feet before she'd thought about it, knife out, scanning. Nothing. Just the Highland Knight doing what Highland Knights did. She sat back down. She thought about the tall man. She thought about Valyrian gates and dragon eggs and a child who looked at old magic and described it the way you described a familiar face. She thought about the way Harry had named the dragon for them without knowing what the names meant, working from feeling alone, as though he already trusted them enough to honor them. She'd had a list for years. Names on a list. She'd crossed some of them off and the crossing off had felt like something was resolved, and then a day later the something was still there, unresolved, and she'd understood gradually that the list had never been about resolution. It was about love. It was about Rob and Ned and her mother and the people the world had taken from her and the only way she'd known how to hold them. She looked at Harry asleep by the fire. She thought, maybe there's another way to hold the people who matter. She didn't write it down anywhere. She didn't say it. She just held it, the way she held most things that were important, quietly, without ceremony, somewhere underneath everything else. The fire burned lower. The stars moved. The egg pulsed, slow and warm, against a sleeping child's chest. In the morning, everything would be more complicated. Tonight, for once, this was enough. Chapter 3, the man who planned everything. Dumbledore found them on a Tuesday. Arya had been expecting it, which was why she wasn't surprised, and why she'd already chosen the ground. 3 weeks had passed since the ruin. They'd moved twice, first to a small village in the northern highlands called Kinloch, where they'd rented 2 rooms above a pub from a woman named Fiona who asked no questions and accepted cash with the practiced indifference of someone who had housed stranger things than a foreign girl and her brother and their small odd child. Then north again, another week, to a shepherd's cottage that had been empty for 2 seasons and whose owner, a quiet man in Inverness, had accepted 6 months' rent up front without blinking. The cottage sat on a hillside above a loch. It had thick walls and a working fireplace and a table big enough to eat at properly. Harry had a room with an actual bed, which he'd stood in the doorway of for almost a full minute the first time he saw it, not saying anything, just looking at it the way you looked at something you'd been told didn't exist for you. "It's yours," John had said. Harry had walked in and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his palms flat on the mattress and nodded once, decisively, like completing a transaction. The egg sat on the windowsill of Harry's room during the day because he'd decided the morning light was good for it, a conclusion no one had prompted and no one questioned. The gold veins were brighter now than they'd been in the ruin, their pulse slightly quicker. The egg had grown warmer too, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that Harry kept it against his side when he slept, and the temperature of his room was noticeably higher than the rest of the cottage. Arya had been teaching him to move. Not fighting, not yet. Just movement. How to walk quietly, how to change direction without telegraphing it, how to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. She'd started the morning after the ruin, standing in the frost outside the shepherd's cottage, watching Harry attempt to cross the yard without making sound, and found herself thinking of Sirio Florel for the first time in years without the grief hitting her like a wave. Just the memory, clean and useful. What do we say to the god of death? Harry was good at it in the specific way that children were good at things when no one had told them it was supposed to be hard. He had natural balance and natural quiet, both of which Arya suspected were partially products of years spent trying not to be noticed in a house where being noticed was dangerous. She was taking something the Dursleys had tried to use against him and turning it into a tool. John had been teaching him to read. Not that Harry couldn't read, he could, adequately, the standard learning of a child who'd been to school for 2 years. But John was teaching him to read the other things, tracks in mud, wind direction, the difference between a sound that was natural to a landscape and a sound that wasn't. Harry absorbed it with the same quiet intensity he brought to the egg, to Arya's movement lessons, to watching the fire in the evenings. He was building himself a picture of the world from scratch, on his own terms, with no one telling him in advance what the important pieces were. Arya found it extraordinary to watch. She also found it clarifying, in a way she hadn't expected. She'd spent 2 years following Valyrian gates through the margins of this world and that one, half committed to everything because nothing had quite managed to feel like it was worth full commitment. Now she was teaching a 5-year-old to move like water, and she was fully committed, and she recognized the feeling. Dumbledore arrived on a Tuesday morning when Harry was in the yard practicing walking the fence line of the sheep enclosure, balance, foot placement, weight distribution, and John was inside making porridge, and Arya was sitting on the stone wall with her back to the loch watching Harry and also watching everything that wasn't Harry. She saw him coming from a considerable distance. He came up the track from the village below, and she registered several things immediately in the automatic cataloging way she trained into herself. Tall. Old, very old, older than he moved, because he moved well for his age. Long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, robes that were the color of deep water, a long staff that was not quite a walking stick. He walked with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who had always arrived where they intended to arrive and saw no reason to rush since the destination would be there when they got to it. She looked at his face as he got closer. She'd built an impression of Dumbledore from 3 weeks of careful listening, in magical pubs and magical bookshops they'd passed through, in the low conversations of people who knew about Harry Potter and thought other people were out of earshot. He was the most powerful wizard alive. He'd defeated someone terrible a long time ago. He'd defeated someone terrible more recently, or, more precisely, a child had defeated someone terrible, and Dumbledore had organized the conditions under which this had happened. He had the face of someone who was very kind and very certain, and she'd found in her experience that those two qualities in combination were more dangerous than almost any amount of unkindness. She watched him come up the track and didn't move from the wall. Harry had seen him. She knew because the fence-walking stopped and Harry was standing on the fence rail looking at the approaching figure with careful assessment rather than alarm. She'd taught him that, don't react to a new thing until you understand what it is. Harry had absorbed this lesson with unsettling speed. Dumbledore stopped about 10 feet from the wall and looked at Arya with eyes that were very blue and very sharp behind the half-moon glasses. Then he looked at Harry on the fence. Something crossed his face that was more complicated than she had a name for, relief, and guilt, and something that was almost grief, though she couldn't say what he was grieving. "Good morning," he said. His voice was warm, rich, the voice of someone who had spent a very long time being listened to. "I'm Dumbledore," Arya said. He paused. Then inclined his head slightly in the way that people inclined their heads when they were recalibrating. "You know of me. I listen carefully in the places where people talk about you." She didn't move from the wall. "You're the man who put Harry with the Dursleys." A beat. "The magic of that protection, the bolt," she said, "was on the outside of the cupboard door." He was quiet. "The boy was sleeping in a cupboard," she said. "For how long, exactly?" "Since he was placed there at 15 months. Because he's 5 now, which makes roughly 4 years, and from the look of him when we found him I'd say the cupboard had been his standard accommodation rather than the exceptional punishment he'd been trained to pass it off as." She paused. "How many times did you check?" Dumbledore looked at her with an expression that was doing something very subtle and complex behind the warmth, the expression of a person who was very good at justifying things to himself encountering an argument he had not adequately prepared for. "The blood protection required, the blood protection," Arya said, "required a child. It did not require a cupboard." "You don't understand the full." "No," said John, from the doorway of the cottage. He'd come out quietly, she'd heard the door but kept her eyes on Dumbledore, and he was standing with his arms folded and his expression steady, and when John looked like that, flat and immovable as the wall itself, it tended to stop conversations in their tracks. "You can explain the blood protection," John said, walking forward. "You can explain the magic. You can explain why his mother's sacrifice needed grounding somewhere. I'll listen to all of that." He stopped 10 feet from Dumbledore, which put him between Dumbledore and Harry. "What you can't explain, what I don't think you've actually tried to explain to yourself, is why it had to be them. Why it had to be that house, those people, that arrangement." He paused. "Because I've moved through a lot of worlds. I've met a lot of men who made plans for other people's good. And the ones who meant well were always the most dangerous, because they never stopped to ask whether what they decided was good was actually good, or whether it was just convenient." Dumbledore looked at John for a long moment. Then at Arya. Then, finally, at Harry, who had climbed down from the fence rail and was standing a short distance behind Arya with the egg tucked in his arms. He'd brought it outside that morning, as he sometimes did, and looking at Dumbledore with those green eyes in a direct, unblinking way that made the old man's expression do something she couldn't quite read. "Harry," Dumbledore said gently. "Hello," Harry said. No warmth, no hostility. The same way he said most things to new people, collecting information, extending nothing yet. "Do you know who I am?" Arya said you're Dumbledore. John said you make plans. A pause. You came to look at me through my aunt's window when I was very small. I remember your hat. Dumbledore absorbed this. I came to make sure you came to look, Harry said. And then you left. The silence after that had a texture to it. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that finally, Arya thought, had real feeling in it rather than the carefully managed warmth of before. He looked like a man confronting a thing he'd managed to keep slightly out of focus and was now seeing clearly. "May I come inside?" he asked. Arya looked at John. John looked at her. "You can sit here," Arya said, gesturing at the yard. "It's a nice morning." It was not a particularly nice morning. It was cold and grey in the Highland way that suggested it was planning to stay both of those things, but Dumbledore sat down on the low stone bench outside the cottage door with the composure of someone who sat on cold stone in grey mornings all the time and found it perfectly comfortable. Arya sat on the wall. John stayed standing. Harry sat cross-legged on the ground about 4 feet from Dumbledore and held the egg and looked at the old man with the steady attention of someone watching an interesting problem. "I've been looking for you," Dumbledore said to Harry. "I thought you knew where I was," Harry said. "You were moved." "We moved," Harry corrected, mildly. Arya kept her expression neutral. Dumbledore looked at the egg in Harry's lap. She watched him notice it, watched him work out what it was, watched his expression travel from recognition to something that was trying not to be alarm. He had more control than most people, she gave him that. He didn't give himself away except in the small tells of someone who had trained themselves out of large reactions and couldn't entirely suppress the small ones. His fingers tightened slightly on his staff. "That egg," he said carefully. "Nymeria's ghost," Harry said. "That's her name." "Harry." Dumbledore leaned forward slightly. "Where did you find, in a ruin," Arya said. "Under Scotland. A Valyrian site." She said it plainly, watching him process it. The egg was cold. Harry walked in and it wasn't cold anymore. "You took him into a Valyrian ruin." The warmth in Dumbledore's voice had acquired a slight edge, not aggressive, more like a man trying to explain gravity to someone standing too close to a cliff. "The gate took us," she said. "We followed the boy. You don't understand what that means. A Valyrian dragon bond is not, I know what a Valyrian dragon bond is." She looked at him steadily. "I'm from somewhere that remembers." Another recalibration. The half-moon glasses caught the grey light. Dumbledore looked at her and then at John with the expression of someone revising a prior assessment, and she thought she could see the moment he recognized the Valyrian marks on them, the gate travel burns, the old fire quality she'd been told was visible to people who could read such things. "You came through the gates," he said. "We live through the gates," John said. "You're not from this world." "Neither is Valyrian magic," Arya said. "And yet here it is. Here we are." She let that sit. "We're not your problem, Dumbledore. We're not your enemy. We found a child in a cupboard and we took him out of the cupboard. The rest of it, the dragon egg, the ruins, the bond, that happened because it was going to happen. We didn't plan any of it. Unlike some people," John added. Dumbledore was quiet for a while. He looked at Harry again. Harry was now examining the egg closely, tracing one of the gold veins with his finger, apparently having decided that the adult conversation would continue without requiring his active participation. The egg pulsed under his touch. "There are things you need to know," Dumbledore said finally. "About Harry. About what he survived and what it means." "Then tell us," Arya said. So he did. He told them about Voldemort, the name that made every adult in the magical world flinch, but that Dumbledore said plainly, because he was one of the few who refused to hide from it. He told them about James and Lily Potter, about Godric's Hollow, about a curse that should have killed a 15-month-old child and had not, and had instead left a scar and a remnant of something dark tethered to a soul it had failed to destroy. He told them about the prophecy, the one made before Harry was born, the one that named him specifically, the one that said neither could live while the other survived. He didn't tell them about the Horcruxes. Arya was certain of this by the end. There was a shape missing in what he said, a gap in the narrative that had the texture of deliberate omission. She filed it. Harry listened to all of it. He'd stopped examining the egg partway through and was now looking at Dumbledore directly. His expression didn't collapse into anything expected, not fear, not distress, not the overwhelmed blankness of a child receiving information about their dead parents and their dark destiny. He looked like someone adding items to a list they'd already started. When Dumbledore finished, Harry said, "The scar." "Yes. There's something in it." Dumbledore went very still. "What do you mean?" "There's something in the scar," Harry said again, patient as anything. "Something that's not mine. I can feel it. It's like," he considered. "Like when you have a splinter and you know exactly where it is even when you're not touching it." He looked at Dumbledore. "What is it?" The silence was significant. Arya watched Dumbledore's face with complete attention and saw him decide, not whether to lie, because she didn't think he was capable of clean lying, but how much truth to give, how to calibrate it, how to present what he knew in a way that produced the outcome he needed. "Something that requires very careful handling," he said, "when the time comes." "Is it part of him?" Arya asked. She was watching Dumbledore's face and she saw the answer before he gave it. "The Dark Wizard. Is there a piece of him in Harry's scar?" "The magic that, yes or no?" "Yes." Harry reached up and touched the scar with 2 fingers. He pressed it lightly, the way you pressed a bruise, taking its measure. "Can it be removed?" "In time," Dumbledore said. He was talking carefully now, more carefully than before, because Harry's directness had wrong-footed him in the same way it wrong-footed everyone. He'd prepared for a vulnerable child and found instead something that looked at him without flinching and asked precise questions. When Voldemort is dealt with, you said the prophecy says one of us has to kill the other," Harry said. "In essence. So your plan is for me to be the one who kills him?" "My hope is that when the time, and everything before that," Harry said, "is preparation. Making me ready for that." He looked at Dumbledore with those green eyes. "Is that why you put me with my aunt and uncle? Not just for the blood protection. Because you needed me to be a specific way. You needed me to be," he paused, working through it. "Small," he said. "You needed me to be small so I'd be grateful when someone told me I was important. So I'd be easy to direct." The yard was quiet. A bird crossed the sky above the loch. John was looking at Harry with an expression that Arya could only describe as love mixed with something like grief, the grief of recognizing yourself in someone else's damage. Dumbledore's face had gone through something she'd never seen a face do quite like that before. Not shame, exactly, because she didn't think Dumbledore was capable of straightforward shame, his belief in his own good intentions was too thorough. But something adjacent to it. The discomfort of a person who has seen themselves accurately, from the outside, for the first time. "I made choices," he said quietly, "that I believed were necessary." "I know," Harry said. He said it without anger, which was somehow worse. "That's the problem." He looked back down at the egg. The gold veins pulsed. Dumbledore sat with that for a long moment. Then he looked at Arya. "He needs training," he said, and his voice had changed, the warmth was still there but the management was slightly less tightly controlled. "Proper magical training. He needs to understand the wizarding world. He needs to be prepared, he needs breakfast," Arya said, "and someone to keep teaching him that he's capable of handling himself." She met Dumbledore's eyes. "We're doing that. You're not wizards." "No. We're something else." She looked at him levelly. "And he's something else. Whatever magical school you had planned for him, it'll still be there. The wizarding world will still be there. Voldemort's remnant will still be there." She paused. "But Harry didn't grow up in a cupboard, so when he walks into all of that, he'll walk in differently." "Better." Another pause. "That changes the calculation. Doesn't it?" Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. "You're very sure of yourselves," he said finally, but it wasn't quite criticism. "We're sure of him," John said. "That's different." Silence. Dumbledore rose, slowly, with the slight deliberateness of very old bones on cold mornings. He adjusted his robes. He looked at Harry one more time and Harry looked back and neither of them said anything, but Arya had the sense of something passing between them, some first version of an understanding that had a long time yet to develop. "I'll need to know he's safe," Dumbledore said. "He is," Arya said. "I'll need to be able to reach him. When we decide you can." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite frustration, something compressed between them. "You're a remarkable young woman." "I know," she said. "Goodbye." He went back down the track. They watched him go, Arya from the wall, John from the doorway, Harry still cross-legged on the ground with the egg. He walked with the same unhurried certainty he'd arrived with, and he didn't look back. When he was gone, Harry looked up at Arya. "He's not a bad man," Harry said. "No. But he was going to use me." "Yes. With good reasons." He thought so. Harry was quiet for a moment. "My aunt thought she had good reasons too," he said, and then stood up and carried the egg inside, leaving Arya and John to look at each other in the cold Highland morning. "He's 5, John said, quietly. "I know. I know, John." John looked down the track where Dumbledore had gone. His expression had settled into something she didn't have a name for, something that was fierce and careful and forward-looking, the expression of a person who had decided to stand between something and everything else. "Dumbledore's going to keep watching," he said. "Obviously. He's going to wait to see if we're doing it right. By his standards." "Let him watch," she said, climbing down from the wall. "He's going to see something he didn't plan for." She went inside. Harry was at the table with the egg, and John had come in behind her and was stoking the fire back to proper life, and the cottage was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke. Through the window, the lock caught the grey morning light and threw it back silver. "Right," Arya said, sitting across from Harry. "Show me where you've gotten to with the fire." Harry looked up. "What do you mean?" "The magic. The accidental kind. Have you felt it since we've been here?" He considered. "Once. Last week. I knocked the cup off the table and it stopped. Before it hit the floor." "Did you mean to stop it?" "I didn't want it to break." "That's the same thing." She put a cup on the table between them. "Try it deliberately. Try to want something specific and see if it happens." "I don't know how, nobody knows how the first time," she said. "Just try." He looked at the cup. He looked at it with the same focused attention he gave the egg, the fire, the tracks in the morning mud. She watched his face concentrate into something very still. The cup wobbled. It didn't move significantly, a slight vibration, a tremor, the kind of thing you could talk yourself out of having seen. But both of them saw it. Harry looked at his hands. "Again," Arya said. He looked at the cup again. This time it slid half an inch across the table. He pulled his focus back and it stopped. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person who has confirmed something they already knew and finds the confirmation both satisfying and slightly alarming. "It works when I pay attention," he said. "Everything works when you pay attention," she told him. "That's the entire point." He looked at the cup. Pushed it back to center with his finger. Then looked at it again with his focused stillness, and it slid back the half-inch like it was on a track. John laughed, a short, real one, from the fireplace. "He's got it already," he said. "He had it before," Arya said. "He just needed permission." Harry looked up at her with something on his face she hadn't seen there before. Not the calculating steadiness, not the careful practicality. Something younger, more unguarded. Something that was, she realized, simply happiness, the raw, uncomplicated happiness of a child who has just discovered they can do something real and have not been punished for it. "Can I try with the fire?" he asked. She looked at the fireplace. Looked at John, who made a face that said probably and also I take no responsibility if the cottage burns down. "Small fire," she said. "The candle on the shelf." Harry crossed to the candle. He stood in front of it and looked at it with his entire face. The wick smoked. It blackened. And then, slowly, wavering, unsteady as a first step, it caught, and a flame stood up from it, and the light changed. Harry held his breath for 3 full seconds. Then he turned around with the happiness still on his face, bigger now, and Arya thought, this is what it should have looked like from the beginning. This is what 5 looks like when it isn't afraid. Right, she said, keeping her voice level because if she let herself feel the full weight of the moment she'd be useless for the rest of the morning. Again. Put it out and do it again. He turned back to the candle. The flame went out. Came back. Went out. Came back, steadier this time. Outside, the lock went on being silver. The Highland morning went on being cold and grey. The egg on the table pulsed its slow gold pulse, slightly faster than yesterday, and the cottage was warm, and somewhere down the track Dumbledore was making his own calculations, and none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the small dark-haired boy at the candle, learning that his magic came when he called it, learning that power was not something that happened to you but something you chose, flame up and flame down, again and again in the morning light. Chapter 4, Sharp Things and Sharper People. 2 years passed the way good years do, not quickly, not slowly, but fully, the way a fire burns when it has enough wood and enough air and no one is trying to put it out. Harry was 7. He was still small for his age, still dark-haired and green-eyed, still prone to the focused stillness that made adults recalibrate their assumptions about what a child was doing when it went quiet. But the boy who'd pressed himself into the corner of a cupboard was gone in the way that things are gone when they've been replaced by something better, not forgotten, not erased, just superseded. He moved through the world now with the particular ease of someone who had been taught to occupy space deliberately and had decided he liked it. The cottage had become home in the complete sense of the word. They'd reinforced the walls with what John called practical layering and Arya called stop touching my wardwork, a combination of Valyrian sigils she'd learned from the ruins and the standard defensive magic of this world, pulled from books bought in the magical district of Edinburgh that had materialized behind a wool shop and smelled of old parchment and very strong tea. The loch below them was cold and deep and Harry had learned to swim in it over 2 summers, which Arya had taught him with the same approach she brought to everything. Put the person in the situation and tell them what they needed while they were already doing it. Harry had not drowned. He'd argued this was evidence of good instruction. Arya had argued it was evidence of basic competence. John had watched from the bank and occasionally thrown him a rope and they'd all agreed the rope was unnecessary and John had kept throwing it anyway. Nymeria's ghost had hatched in early spring of Harry's 2nd year with them. It had happened at 3 in the morning during a thunderstorm that seemed, in retrospect, to have been less meteorological than reactive. Harry had been asleep. The egg had been on his windowsill where it always was, and Arya had been awake because she was often awake at 3 in the morning, which was a habit she developed in places where sleeping through the night was a philosophical position rather than a practical one. She'd heard the sound, not a crack, not the dramatic shattering she might have expected, but a sustained low tone, like a very large instrument played very softly, resonating through the stone walls of the cottage. She'd gone to Harry's room and the egg had been splitting along the gold veins, the black shell separating at its seams with immense deliberate care, and Harry was awake, sitting straight up in bed, completely calm, watching it with the expression of someone attending something they'd been waiting for. The dragon that emerged was the size of a large cat and black as the egg had been, with those same gold veins running along its neck and wing joints and the ridge of its spine. Its eyes, when it opened them and looked at Harry, were the color of molten gold. It had crawled directly to Harry and settled on his chest and they'd looked at each other for a long wordless moment, and then the dragon had made a sound that was not quite a purr and not quite a growl but contained elements of both, and Harry had said, very quietly, "Hello, Nymeria's ghost." Arya had stood in the doorway and felt something she still didn't entirely have language for. Not maternal, she was 17 when Harry came to them, 19 now, too young and too jagged to be anyone's mother in the conventional sense. Something more lateral. Something that was proud and protective and somehow ancient, like an instinct from further back than herself. John had appeared behind her in the doorway, looked at the dragon on Harry's chest, looked at Harry's face, looked at Arya. She's beautiful, he'd said. The dragon had looked at him with those gold eyes and made the sound again. She hears you, Harry said. She knows your name. 2 years on, Nymeria's ghost was roughly the size of a large dog and growing with the stubborn insistence of something that had a clear idea of what it intended to be. She flew, had been flying since the 2nd month, tentatively at first, then with increasing recklessness, pulling up at the last moment before hitting something in a way that suggested she found the near misses funny. She breathed fire in controlled bursts when Harry asked her to, and in enthusiastic uncontrolled bursts when she thought it would be interesting. She'd burned a hole in the cottage roof once and sat in it looking down at them through the smoke with a complete absence of remorse. She went where Harry went and slept where Harry slept and had learned to make herself small, not invisible. She couldn't manage that, but compact, reduced, tucked in close in a way that made the eye slide off her in crowds. Harry had taught her this. Or she'd taught Harry. Arya suspected the communication went both ways in a way she couldn't fully map. On a grey October morning, 2 weeks after Harry's 7th birthday, a woman arrived at the bottom of their track. Arya saw her from the window while she was working through her water-dancing forms, the morning movement that kept the Valyrian work in her hands sharp. She was tall, dark-skinned, wearing robes that were somehow both impractical and authoritative, and she was looking up at the cottage with the expression of someone who had directions and was confirming they were correct. Behind Arya, Harry was at the table practicing his letters in the old Valyrian script she'd been teaching him for 6 months, not because it was immediately useful but because the shapes of the letters seemed to activate something in him that she'd learned to feed rather than question. Nymeria's ghost was on the chair beside him, watching the letters being made with apparent editorial interest, occasionally touching a letter with one claw. "Someone's coming," Arya said. Harry looked up. "Wizard or normal?" "Wizard. Dumbledore sent her." "Not Dumbledore." Arya had gotten good at reading the particular quality of different magical people. Dumbledore had a specific weight to him, the specific density of power that had been used and redirected and accumulated over a very long life. This woman's magic was different, more current, more immediate, like a river rather than a reservoir. Someone with her own reasons. John came in from outside, where he'd been doing something practical to the woodpile, the way he always found something practical to do with his hands when he was thinking. He looked out the window. "Professor type," he said. "What makes you say that?" "She's measuring the place," he said. "Not looking at it, measuring it. Cataloging. That's someone who assesses for a living." Arya considered this. "Let her come up." She opened the door when the woman was halfway up the track and stood in the doorway in the way she stood in doorways when she wanted the geometry of the space to communicate something, not a threat, but an awareness. "I saw you coming. I've been watching. I know exactly how close you are." The woman stopped at the edge of the yard and they looked at each other. She was perhaps 40, with sharp intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had never once been uncertain of her right to occupy a room. She had a wand at her belt, Arya noted its exact position out of automatic habit, and her robes had the crest of an institution she didn't recognize on them, not Hogwarts, something older. "My name is Professor Adiz Okafor," the woman said. Her voice had a musical precision to it, accented in a way Arya couldn't fully place. "I teach ancient magical theory at Wagadu. I'm not here to take anyone anywhere, before you decide how to arrange your hands." She looked at where Arya's right hand had drifted to. "I'm here because I heard something remarkable happen 2 years ago in a Valyrian ruin under the Highlands, and I study Valyrian magic, and remarkable things that happen in Valyrian ruins are professionally important to me." "Who told you?" Arya asked. "The ruins themselves," Okafor said, simply. "Valyrian sites communicate. If you've spent any time in them you've probably noticed they have a kind of memory. The ruin here registered a bonding event for the first time in recorded history. In my field that's the equivalent of a mountain moving." She paused. "I'd like to meet the child. He's not on display. I'm not a collector." Okafor's voice stayed level and her eyes stayed direct. "I'm someone who knows things about what he is that you might find useful." That's all I'm offering. Arya looked at her for a long moment, doing the calculation. Okafor waited without discomfort, which told her she was either patient or very good at performing patience. She looked back into the cottage. "Harry," she called. He appeared in the doorway beside her with Nymeria's ghost on his shoulder, her tail looped around his upper arm for balance, her gold eyes on Okafor. Harry looked at Okafor with his customary measuring regard. Okafor looked back at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be professionally composed and was only partially succeeding. "That's a Valyrian dragon," Okafor said, very quietly. "She's Nymeria's ghost," Harry said. "She's mine." Okafor looked at him, really looked, the way people sometimes looked at Harry when they saw him clearly for the first time, as though they'd been expecting something else and were making rapid adjustments. "How old are you?" "7. "And how long has she been hatched?" "Since spring last year." Okafor made a sound that was scholarly wonder wearing professional clothing. "May I come in?" Arya looked at Harry. Harry looked at the dragon. The dragon looked at Okafor with gold eyes and then made the small sound that Arya had learned meant not a threat, slightly different from the sound she made for John and different again from the sound she made for Arya, but in the same register, the register of things she decided were acceptable. "Yes," Harry said, and stood aside. They sat around the cottage table. John came in from the woodpile and did the calculation in approximately 4 seconds and then made tea, because he made tea the way other people breathed, automatically, in any situation, regardless of what else was happening, as though the act of making tea was the first step in addressing any problem. He set a cup in front of Okafor and she looked at it and then at him with mild surprise and said, "Thank you," in the tone of someone who hadn't expected consideration from the direction of the large man with the quiet eyes. Okafor opened a leather satchel and laid 3 books on the table with the care of someone handling their most valued things. They were old, very old, the kind of old that was past crumbling and had reached a kind of architectural integrity, like the books had decided to stay intact out of sheer stubbornness. The writing on the covers was in Valyrian, and Harry leaned forward immediately. "I can read some of that," he said. Okafor looked at him sharply. "Where did you learn Valyrian?" "Arya taught me." "You read High Valyrian," Okafor said to Arya. "Enough," Arya said, which was more true now than it had been 2 years ago. The ruins had helped. The language came back to her from the marks the gates had left on her, surfacing sometimes in the middle of the night like a memory that wasn't hers. She suspected it was, in some sense, exactly that. Okafor opened the topmost book to a marked page and turned it to face Harry. The illustration showed a figure, human-shaped, young, impossible to gender at this distance, with lines of gold running from their hands upward to a dragon in flight. The lines matched exactly the veins on Nymeria's ghost. "Dragon Lord," Harry said, reading the Valyrian caption. Okafor sat back. "You can read that." "She taught me the letters," Harry said, meaning Arya. "And the words are, I don't know all of them, but that one I know." He pointed at it. "Dracaries," he said, and the word came out of him with a precision and a resonance that made Nymeria's ghost lift her head sharply and make a sound like contained fire. "That's fire." "That is fire," Okafor agreed, and she was looking at Harry with the expression that Arya was beginning to recognize as the appropriate response to spending time with him, the expression of someone systematically revising upward. The Valyrian dragon lords were the rulers of old Valyria. Their power came from a specific magical bond, a bonding of blood and fire and intent that couldn't be manufactured or transferred or inherited in the conventional sense. It had to be recognized. She paused. The dragon had to choose. And the dragon chose based on something in the soul of the person, a quality the Valyrians called Enigar. It doesn't translate directly. The closest is something like fire true, someone who is what fire is. Consuming. Honest. Unstoppable. Harry was looking at the illustration. What happened to them? The Dragon Lords. Valyria fell. The doom. Whatever caused it destroyed the seat of the Dragon Lord's power. The bonds broke. The dragons, she paused, choosing her words. Most of them didn't survive. The ones that did were changed. Diminished. The eggs that were carried out before the doom gradually went cold as the centuries passed and there was no one left to wake them. Until Harry, John said. Until Harry. Okafor looked at him across the table. There have been people since with Valyrian blood who could bond with dragons, the Targaryens, in our world's history. But this, she looked at the egg shells, which Harry kept on his windowsill, which Arya thought was either deeply sentimental or something more instinctive. This is a full bonding. Not a hereditary echo. Not a blood right. A genuine recognition. She looked at Harry. She chose you specifically. I know, Harry said, without ego, just as statement of fact. The dragon shifted on his shoulder and pressed her head briefly against his cheek. She tells me things. What sort of things? Feelings, mostly. What she wants. What she thinks about things. Sometimes, pictures. Like if she sees something interesting she shows it to me later. He considered. Last week she showed me a deer she'd seen by the loch. Just the deer. I think she wanted me to see it too. Okafor was writing in a notebook with a speed that suggested she was trying to capture water with her hands. Arya let her write. There was something about the woman that she'd been calibrating throughout the conversation, and she'd reached a conclusion she thought was reliable. Okafor was what she said she was. She was someone who loved knowledge the way Arya loved movement, completely, practically, for its own sake. She wasn't trying to take anything. She was trying to understand something, and understanding it genuinely required the thing to be left in place. You said you know things that would be useful, John said, cutting to what mattered. Specifically. Okafor closed her notebook. The Valyrian dragon bond changes the person, she said. Not just the relationship. The person. Their magic, both the bond magic and any existing magic they had, deepens and compounds. A wizard who bonds with a dragon doesn't become a better wizard. They become something else. Something larger. She looked at Harry. You've noticed changes. My magic works better, Harry said. It started changing when she hatched. It's faster and, it listens better. It's integrating, Okafor said. The two systems are learning to work together. The bond is restructuring your magical framework. She paused. This is going to continue. It's going to become very noticeable very quickly. How noticeable? Arya asked. The kind of noticeable that people talk about, Okafor said, meeting her eyes. The kind that reaches Dumbledore. Dumbledore already knows about the bond. Dumbledore knows a dragon egg hatched. He doesn't know the bond has fully integrated. When it finishes, she paused. The last fully bonded dragon lord, by historical accounts, could bring down castle walls. A silence. He's 7, John said. I'm aware, Okafor said, and she said it kindly. I'm not suggesting anything needs to be done about it. I'm suggesting that what's happening here is historically unprecedented and that the boy in question should understand what he is. Fully. Without having it managed for him. She looked at Arya. You agree with that principle or I wouldn't be inside your ward line. What are you offering? Arya asked. Information, Okafor said. The books in my field that pertain to this. My own expertise, available to you and to him, without agenda. And, she reached into her satchel again and produced a small stone, flat and dark, with a Valyrian glyph carved into it. A communication stone. When you want me. I won't come uninvited. She set the stone on the table. Harry looked at it, then picked it up and turned it over in his hands. Nymeria's ghost looked at it and made no sound, which was its own kind of verdict. We'll think about it, Arya said. Of course, Okafor said, and stood, and gathered her books with the same care she'd placed them, and that was that. John walked her to the bottom of the track and they talked for a few minutes in the low voices of people exchanging information without preamble, and Arya watched from the yard with her hand loose near her knife without it being a threat. Harry came to stand beside her, the communication stone in his hand and the dragon on his shoulder. "I like her," he said. "Why?" He thought about it properly, the way he thought about things. "She looked at Nymeria's ghost like she mattered," he said. "Not like she was interesting. Like she mattered." Arya looked down at him. At the dragon, who was watching Okafor's retreating back with an expression that was, somehow, considering. "You can keep the stone," she said. He closed his hand around it. 3 days later came the first person who wasn't interested in helping. He arrived at noon, which Arya found ostentatious. Noon arrivals announced themselves, chose the lighting deliberately, had something to prove about standing in daylight. He was younger than Dumbledore, perhaps 60, with pale sharp features and robes that were expensive in a specific architectural way that communicated institutional allegiance. His name, she'd learned later, was Aldrich Selwyn. Old wizarding family. Ministry of Magic connections. The kind of man who had decided somewhere in his 50s that he was one of the people the world was organized around. He didn't come up the track alone. He brought 2 others, standing slightly behind him in the arranged geometry of people who were there to indicate his importance. They didn't introduce themselves. Harry was in the yard when they arrived, working through a series of movements Arya had set him, the water dancer footwork, figure-8 patterns around stones she'd placed, first without magic, then with it. He'd been at it for an hour. He was wearing the plain dark clothing they'd settled into as practical default, his hair the perpetual disaster it always was, and Nymeria's ghost was 50 feet above the lock doing something acrobatic and unnecessary. Selwyn saw Harry and then looked past him at the cottage for the more significant person, decided there wasn't one visible, looked back at Harry with the recalibrated expression of a man adjusting his entry. "You're the boy," he said. "Harry Potter." Harry finished his current movement pattern and stood at ease, which was an Arya-specific stand at ease and therefore looked nothing like military ease and everything like readiness at rest. He looked at Selwyn. "Yes. My name is Aldrich Selwyn. I'm here on behalf of—" "No you're not," Arya said, from the wall. Selwyn looked at her with the mild affront of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted. "I beg your pardon. You're not here on anyone's behalf," she said. "You're here for yourself. Your ministry colleagues don't know you're here, or if they do they've given you informal sanction. Either way the ministry hasn't officially sanctioned a visit to a miner's home, or you'd have paperwork and you don't." She'd watched him come up the track. No briefcase, no official documentation, nothing formal. He'd come with muscle, which was what men came with when they couldn't come with authority. "What do you want?" Selwyn's mild affront had upgraded itself. He was reassessing, doing what men like him always did when a young woman spoke to them like this, cycling through condescension, irritation, strategic recalibration, landing on the last one because he was smarter than he was proud. "There are people," he said carefully, "in positions of influence, who are concerned about the situation here." "What situation?" "An 8-year-old child, 7, Harry said. "In an unsupervised, we're his guardians," John said, appearing from around the side of the cottage. He'd come from the wood store and was carrying an axe and he hadn't put it down, which was a choice. "We have documentation." They did. Okafor had helped them with that, 2 weeks ago, through channels in the magical world that had no interest in the ministry's opinion. "Would you like to see it?" Selwyn looked at John and the axe and decided not to take that specific road. "The concern," he continued, "is about the nature of what this child is becoming. A Valyrian dragon bond is not something that should be developing in an unsupervised environment. The ministry has a responsibility." "The ministry had no responsibility toward him for 5 years, Arya said. He spent those years in a cupboard. Where was the ministry's concern then?" The Dumbledore arrangement was a child in a cupboard," Harry said. Selwyn looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him with a steadiness that Selwyn clearly hadn't expected from a 7-year-old, and she watched the man recalibrate again, this time with a different quality, the quality of someone who has found something they wanted and is beginning to think about how to obtain it rather than how to manage it. "You're remarkable," Selwyn said, and he said it warmly, which was worse than the official tone. "What you're developing, the bond, the power, it's extraordinary. The magical world would want to celebrate that. To support it." He smiled. "The right education. The right connections. You'd want for nothing." "I don't want for anything now," Harry said. Selwyn's smile adjusted fractionally. "There are things you haven't had access to yet. What do you want?" Arya said again, because she was done with the approach and wanted the destination. Selwyn looked at her with the first flash of real irritation. Then he brought it back under control and looked at Harry. "There are people who would benefit from your association," he said, dropping the pretense by degrees. "People with significant influence. Who could ensure that when you come of age, you want to own him," John said. The directness of it landed in the yard like something dropped from height. Selwyn's face went through several stages. "That's not, you want to position yourself now," John said, "so that when he's powerful enough to matter, you've got a claim on him. A relationship. An obligation." He set the axe against the wall and folded his arms. "I've seen this before. Different world, same behavior. The powerful man who gets to a child early so the child grows up thinking they owe him something." Selwyn looked at John and then at Arya and then at Harry, and whatever calculation he'd been running had clearly not produced a favorable result. He'd come expecting a vulnerable child in an informal arrangement that could be disrupted with the right application of institutional pressure. He'd found something different and he was adjusting to that on the fly, which meant his position was weaker than he'd thought it was. "You're being very dramatic," he said. "You brought 2 large men up my track at noon on a day you knew I'd be here," Arya said. "Which of us is being dramatic?" A long pause. Above the lock, Nymeria's ghost had stopped her acrobatics and was circling. Not diving, not threatening, circling, the slow circle of something very large that was paying attention. One of the men behind Selwyn looked up and went visibly pale. The other kept his face professional with some effort. Harry had not looked at the dragon. He kept his eyes on Selwyn with the steady measuring regard he'd been using the whole conversation, the regard that gave nothing away and took everything in, and Arya thought, not for the first time, that of all the things they'd taught him the most important might simply have been this: how to stand in front of a person who wanted something from you and give them absolutely nothing until you decided what you wanted to give. "This conversation is finished," Harry said. Selwyn looked at him, at this 7-year-old with the dragon circling above him and 2 people who would not be moved standing on either side of him, and Arya watched the man make the calculation she'd been waiting for him to make. He turned and walked back down the track. His 2 companions followed. Nobody spoke. The sound of their footsteps faded, and then the afternoon was just the afternoon again, the lock, the grey sky, the wind off the mountains, the dragon completing one more circle before dropping elegantly to land on the fence rail 10 feet away and regard the departing figures with manifest contempt. Harry watched them go. Then turned to Arya. "He'll come back," he said. "Or someone like him will." "Yes. What do we do about that?" She thought about it. "We make sure that when they come back, there's less to argue about. Less ambiguity about who you are and what you're doing and whether you're adequately, everything." She paused. "Okafor." She offered structured learning. "We should take her up on it. So they can't say I'm unsupervised. So they're demonstrably wrong about everything they might say." She looked at him. "And because you need to know things. Not for them. For you." He nodded, the decisive single nod she'd come to recognize as his version of a closed matter. Reached up and scratched Nymeria's ghost behind the jaw, and the dragon made the contained fire sound and leaned into it. "I want to learn to fight," Harry said. "Properly. With a sword." She looked at him. "You've been doing the footwork for a year." The footwork isn't fighting. The footwork is the foundation. Then I have the foundation. He looked at her directly. Teach me the next part. She looked at his feet, their placement, the automatic correctness of his stance, the balance that she drilled into him until it became unconscious. She looked at his hands. She thought about what Okafor had said, something larger. She thought about the years ahead of them and what he'd need to walk through them not just intact but as himself. Fully himself. She went inside and came back with 2 practice sticks, straight lengths of ash she'd cut and balanced herself, weighted to approximate swords without having edges. She tossed one to Harry. He caught it without looking up from adjusting his grip, the catch automatic, comfortable. She came at him immediately, no warning, the first move already committed before he'd fully registered that they'd started. He blocked it, clumsily, too much arm, not enough body, and she got through on the second move and tapped his shoulder. Footwork first, she said. Always footwork first, he said, and reset. She came again. He lasted 4 exchanges before she got through. 6 exchanges on the next run. 8 on the one after. She watched his body learn from itself, the way bodies did when they'd been laid the right foundation, each mistake feeding forward, each correction becoming automatic faster than it should have. John came around the corner at the 3rd hour and watched for a few minutes. Nymeria's ghost had come off the fence rail and was lying on the cottage roof watching with her head on her forepaws. The afternoon light was going gold. He's good, John said, quietly. He's better than good, Arya said, without stopping, because Harry was right there and could hear them. He's fast. He's adjusting mid-exchange already. She went at Harry again, changing the angle. He moved his feet before his hands, which was exactly correct, and she had to work for the opening. Harry's magic had started bleeding into his movement during the 3rd hour, without him trying to do it. She'd noticed it as a slight enhancement to his reaction time, a half-second advantage in anticipating the strike's direction. She hadn't told him to stop. She'd adjusted her own speed to compensate, and he'd adjusted to that, and they'd been escalating for 20 minutes without either of them acknowledging it. She stopped. Harry stopped. He was breathing hard but controlled. Sweat at his temples. Your magic is doing something, she said. I know. No apology in it. Is it deliberate? He thought about it honestly. It started not deliberate. Now I know it's happening so he considered. I'm not stopping it. Good, she said. He looked at her, checking whether she meant it. Good, she said again. Whatever you have, use it. Don't leave weapons on the table because you think the fight should be fair. She met his eyes. The fight is never fair. You make it less unfair. That's all. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised the practice stick in a guard position that was unmistakably hers, her stance, her geometry, her opening, and looked at her with a small expression that was very close to a smile but had more edge to it than a smile usually carried. She brought her stick up. They kept going. Above them, Nymeria's ghost watched from the cottage roof with her gold eyes moving between them, and the sun moved west, and the loch below went dark, and the highland evening settled in around the yard, cold and clear and smelling of old mountains. Harry was 7 years old and he was learning to fight, and his magic moved through him like a current, and his dragon watched from above with eyes like molten gold. Somewhere down the track, men with plans were making their calculations. Harry Potter was not in their calculations. That was going to be a problem for them. Chapter 5, Letters and Fire. The Hogwarts letters arrived on a Thursday in July, which was the kind of specific detail that lodged in the memory because of what surrounded it. Harry was 10. He'd been 10 for 3 weeks, and the birthday had been marked the way they'd established over 5 years of living together, not with ceremony, because none of them were particularly ceremonial, but with intention. John had made venison stew from a deer they tracked together through the forest east of the loch. Arya had given him a knife, real this time, not a practice blade, bone-handled and perfectly balanced, the kind of knife that said I trust your hands with this. Okafor had sent a package through the communication stone, 3 books in High Valyrian, a letter that was dense with theoretical magic, and a small carved figure of a dragon in obsidian that Harry had set next to the egg shells on his windowsill. Nymeria's ghost had given him the remains of a very large fish, presented with evident pride, which he'd accepted with appropriate gravity before discreetly relocating it to the yard. The letters arrived Thursday morning. Not 1, 7, by Arya's count, from 7 different institutions, all arriving within the same hour in the way that magical correspondence arrived when multiple senders released it on the same date, the envelopes materializing in a loose cluster on the kitchen table while Harry was outside running the footwork patterns he still did every morning, not because Arya made him anymore but because he'd decided the morning didn't start right without them. She counted them. Stacked them neatly. Read the return addresses on each. Hogwarts. Wagadu. Durmstrang. Ilvermorny. 2 she didn't recognize, smaller institutions, regional, from the looks of the crests. And 1 with no crest at all, sealed in black wax, which she set aside and looked at for a long moment before putting it at the bottom of the stack. John came in and looked at the stack and then at her. How many? 7. Hogwarts is in there. Yes. Dumbledore sent it himself. She checked the Hogwarts letter. The wax seal was the school crest, not Dumbledore's personal mark. The school sent it. He might not even know about the others. Harry came in from outside, flushed with cold morning air, Nymeria's ghost draped across his shoulders like a very animate and occasionally unreasonable scarf. She'd grown again over the summer, she was the size of a large stallion now when she stretched out, with a wingspan that required her to be thoughtful about doorways. Inside she made herself compact and wore herself on Harry's shoulders or curled on the floor beside the fire, and in the yard she spread and became what she was, something that crossed the sky like a decision. Harry saw the letters. He came to the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he sat down, pulled the stack toward him, and went through them one by one with the systematic focus of someone who had been taught that information was for using. He read the Hogwarts letter first. All of it. Set it down. Picked up Wagadu's, thicker, denser, Okafor's institution. Read that. Set it down. Went through the rest in order. The black sealed letter he turned over once, looked at the absence of a crest, and opened it with his thumb. He read it. His face didn't change but Nymeria's ghost, on his shoulders, made the low sound that meant something was wrong in the way that the bond transmitted wrong, not danger, something more complex than danger. What is it? Arya asked. Harry set the black letter down and turned it to face her. The paper was different from the others, not parchment, not the standard magical correspondence material, but something that felt slightly wrong to the touch, slightly too smooth. The writing was in ordinary ink but the letters had a quality, a slight depth to them, as though they'd been pressed into the page from underneath rather than applied to the surface. The message was 3 lines. We know where you are. We know what you're becoming. The Dark Lord's unfinished business is not finished. No signature. John read it over her shoulder. She felt him go still. The remnant, he said. Someone acting for it, Arya said. Voldemort isn't functional enough to send letters. She'd spent 5 years building a picture of the situation, piece by piece, from Okafor and from books and from the careful conversations she'd extracted from Dumbledore's 2 subsequent visits. The remnant of Voldemort existed somewhere without a body, a piece of something that had once been a person, sustained by the Horcruxes she was increasingly certain Dumbledore hadn't told them about, connected to Harry through the scar in a way she'd been thinking about for 2 years. Someone with enough loyalty left to act. They found us, John said. They found us a while ago, she corrected. They're announcing it now. There's a difference. Why announce it? To move us, Harry said. They both looked at him. He'd been sitting with both hands flat on the table and Nymeria's ghost still making her low sound, and he was looking at the black letter with the expression he used for things he was pulling apart. They want us to run, he said. Or they want us to worry about running. Because if we're worried about them, we're not doing something else. He looked up at Arya. What are we not doing that matters? She looked at the school letters. The letters, she said. Today's the day they arrived. The black letter arrived today too, same time, not by accident. Someone who knew the other letters were coming wanted us to get this at the same time. Why does it matter if I go to school? Harry asked. It matters because of what school means, John said, working it through. School means a world. A wizarding world. Connections, allies, people who know you. Resources. He paused. Dumbledore's plan needs you isolated and shaped. Voldemort's people need you afraid and reactive. He looked at the letter. Both of them have a problem if you walk into the wizarding world on your own terms, as what you actually are. Harry looked at the school letters. Then at the black letter. Then at Arya. Which school? He asked. She blinked. What? Which school do I pick? He said it with complete practicality. Not Hogwarts. Dumbledore runs Hogwarts. He doesn't run it, he influences it. And it's in Britain, which is where most of the things wanting access to me are. Harry moved the Hogwarts letter to one side. Wagadu is Okafor's school. She said once that it has the best ancient magical theory program in the world. He moved the Wagadu letter to the front. But Durmstrang, he picked up that envelope, looked at the crest. John said once the Valyrian ruins run deepest under northern Europe. The Durmstrang location is near 3 of the sites we haven't visited. You've been thinking about this, John said. I've been thinking about this since Professor Okafor mentioned the letters would come this year, Harry said. He said it without defensiveness, just confirmation. I didn't know there'd be 7 of them, but I knew Hogwarts would send one and I knew I didn't want to go to Hogwarts. He picked up the Wagadu letter and looked at it. Can I write to Okafor? Yes, Arya said. He was already reaching for parchment. She sat back and looked at John across the table. He was looking at Harry with that expression, the one that wasn't pride exactly, or not only pride, but something wider than pride, the recognition of a person becoming themselves at full speed. She looked at the black letter. We should tell Dumbledore about this, John said quietly. We should understand it better first, she said. She picked the letter up again and looked at it carefully. The paper's quality. The ink. The 3 lines of text with their underground depth. There was magic in it, she could feel that, old magic, dark-edged, carrying the specific cold quality of things that had been kept alive past their natural duration. She pressed 2 fingers flat against the paper and felt it push back, faintly, as though something on the other side of it knew she was reading it and was reading her back. She pulled her fingers away. Nymeria's ghost, across the table, was looking at the letter with fixed attention. Her eyes had gone from their normal gold to something deeper, more orange, the color they went when she was deciding something was a problem. Can she sense it? John asked. She senses everything through Harry, Arya said. And she looked at Harry, who was writing to Okafor with focused speed and hadn't appeared to look at the letter again but whose left hand, the one not holding the quill, was flat on the table in the letter's direction. The warmth coming off that hand was perceptible from 2 feet away. He's already working on it. Working on what? I don't know yet. She found out 4 hours later. They'd spent the morning dealing with the practical. Arya sent her own message to Okafor through the communication stone, flagging the black letter and asking for anything known about remaining Voldemort loyalists capable of locating a warded property this deep in the Highlands. John had checked the ward lines around the cottage, walking the perimeter with the methodical care he'd developed over years of maintaining things that kept people alive in bad conditions. The wards were intact. Whatever had delivered the letter hadn't come through the wards, it had appeared inside them, which was a different and more significant problem. Harry did his sword work in the yard after lunch, but differently than usual. She could tell the difference between his practice mode and his thinking through movement mode, and this was the second one, the pattern of someone using physical motion to process something internal. He ran the forms she'd taught him and the forms he'd started developing himself, the ones that incorporated his magic so naturally she couldn't always see where one ended and the other began. Nymeria's ghost flew above the lock, but lower than usual, her circles tighter, keeping him closer to her range. Then Harry stopped in the middle of the yard and looked north. Arya was sitting on the wall watching him and she tracked the direction of his attention. North, slightly east. Toward the lock, toward the mountain behind it. She felt nothing from that direction. She looked at Harry and looked at the dragon had stopped flying and was hovering, actually hovering, which she didn't usually do, holding position above the yard with her wings working steadily, and looking in the same direction Harry was looking. "Harry," she said. "There's something in the lock," he said. She was off the wall. John came out of the cottage immediately, which meant he'd heard the tone, the specific quality of Harry's voice when he was reporting something real rather than asking a question. "What kind of something?" John said. "Wrong kind," Harry said. He still hadn't looked away from the lock. "Like the letter. Cold. Old." He finally turned, and his eyes had the quality they got when the bond was very active, slightly more present than usual, slightly lit. "It's been there a while. Since before the letter." "How long?" "Maybe a week." Arya and John looked at each other. "Scouting," Arya said. "They sent something first," John agreed. "To confirm the location. Then sent the letter. They know the wards. They know the layout." She was already moving, circling toward the lock side of the yard, running the threat picture. "They're not moving yet. They're watching." "What is it?" John asked Harry. "Can you tell?" Harry was quiet for a moment. Nymeria's ghost dropped lower, coming to hover just above the cottage roof, and Harry and the dragon had the specific stillness of two things sharing attention, the bond running information between them. "Not a person," Harry said. "Something sent. Like, a piece of something. Part of a creature that isn't whole." He looked at Arya. "It's got the same quality as the scar." He said it simply, touching his forehead briefly with two fingers. "Same cold. A Horcrux fragment," she thought. "Or something deployed from one." She'd been reading everything she could find about Voldemort's magic for 2 years since Dumbledore's non-disclosure during the first visit, putting together a picture from scattered sources. What Dumbledore hadn't told them was extensive and critical, and she'd spent a long time being methodically angry about it. "Can you do anything about it?" she asked Harry. She said it directly, not softening it, because softening it would imply she didn't think he could handle the answer. Harry looked at the lock. "Yes," he said. He walked to the lock's edge. She followed 4 paces behind, close enough to be there if he needed her, far enough to not crowd what he was doing. John flanked from the other side. Above them Nymeria's ghost descended to treetop height and her color deepened, the gold of her veins intensifying to something almost white, the color of fire at its center. Harry stood at the water's edge and looked at the lock and was completely still. The stillness lasted maybe 30 seconds and then something changed in the quality of the afternoon. She'd learned over 5 years to read the atmospheric effects of Harry's magic. There was always a feeling, a pressure change, a sense of the air becoming more present before he did something significant. This was larger than anything she'd felt from him before, larger by a significant margin. The air went tight. The lock's surface, which had been rippled by the wind, went smooth. Then Harry raised his right hand and fire ran from his palm into the water. Not into the air, not at the water, into it, the fire transmitting through the surface as though water and fire had reached an arrangement that physics wasn't invited to comment on. The Valyrian fire, which was what it clearly was, the deep gold of it, the same gold as Nymeria's ghost's veins, burning through the lock in a directed line, straight toward the northern bank and then down, diving below the surface. Something in the lock responded. It made a sound she didn't have a word for, not a scream, not mechanical, but an expressing of wrongness, the sound of something unmade encountering the thing that was unmaking it. The water went briefly dark, darker than depth explained, and then the gold fire ran through it again from a different angle, and Nymeria's ghost made a single sound from above, the fire sound, the contained release sound, and then everything went normal. The lock was just the lock again. Harry lowered his hand. He exhaled once. He turned back to them and his eyes were fully gold for 3 seconds before they faded back to green, the bond resonance dissipating. "Gone," he said. John made the specific sound he made when something extraordinary had happened and he was not going to immediately comment on it because doing so would be inadequate. "Are you all right?" Arya asked. "Yes." He looked at his hand. "The fire is easier than it used to be. It doesn't feel like it costs anything anymore." "What does it feel like?" He considered. "Like breathing," he said. "Like it's just, there. When I need it." She nodded. Filed it. Thought about Okafor's word, integrating. Thought about something larger. The bond had been running its integration process for 2 years since Nymeria's ghost hatched and it was not finished, and whatever Harry was now, the completed version was going to be, she didn't have a proper scale for it. She was standing beside it watching it become itself and she thought, good. 2 days later, Okafor arrived in person. She came through the Valyrian gate this time. They'd opened a permanent soft gate at the boundary of the property, which Okafor had helped them establish, stable enough for trusted arrivals, and she came with urgency, which was unusual for her. She normally arrived with the energy of someone who had thought through everything they were going to say and was ready to say it in order. Today she came through the gate and headed straight for the cottage and got to the point before she'd sat down. "The black letter," she said. "I've seen its kind before. Twice. Both times in proximity to Voldemort loyalists operating independently, not the organized remnant, the ideological ones, the ones who believe regardless of whether he tells them to." She spread papers on the table. "The organization calling itself the Vanguard of the Dark. They're small, perhaps 20, 30 people. But they're competent and they're organized and they've been looking for Harry since he disappeared from Privet Drive." "Since he was 5, John said. "Yes. It's taken them this long to narrow the location because your wards are good. The letter tells me they're close but not certain. A certain location means you arrive, not announce yourself. They announce to spook us," Arya said. "Make us move and catch us in transit." "Likely." Okafor sat down. The thing in the lock was a shade, a fragment of dark magic used for reconnaissance. The fact that Harry destroyed it tells them what they needed confirmation of. That the bond is complete. That the power is real. Which makes him more valuable to them, John said. And more of a threat. Okafor looked at Harry. "They'll move soon. Within days." Harry was at the table looking at the papers Okafor had spread. He pointed to one. "This is the Vanguard's organizational structure. As much as we know it." "Who leads it?" "A man named Corvus Mulciber. 40 years old. Old wizarding family, heavy casualties in the first war against Voldemort, lost 3 family members." Okafor paused. "He's not a fanatic. He's a man who's decided that power is the only reliable protection and he's made a theology out of that conclusion." "Where is he?" "Arya," John said, in the warning tone. "I'm asking for information," Arya said. "She's asking for information," Harry confirmed, still looking at the papers. He looked up at Okafor. "What does he want with me, specifically?" "He can't use the bond, it's mine, it's not transferable." "No. But he can use your existence. A living dragon lord with a functioning bond is, historically, the kind of thing that other powerful people follow. If he controls your circumstances, he controls the narrative around you. Who you owe. Who you're loyal to." Okafor met Harry's eyes. "He wants to be the man who has Harry Potter. That's the asset." Harry received this. And Voldemort? His interest is different. His remnant can feel you through the scar. The more your power grows, the louder you are to him. Okafor's voice was careful. There's a theory, I've been working on it for a year, about the fragment in your scar. If the bond's fire is strong enough, it might be possible to, she stopped. To burn it out, Harry said. Theoretically. How theoretical? I don't have a precedent for it. Dragon Lord fire as a cleansing agent for dark soul magic isn't something that's been documented because Dragon Lords haven't existed for a very long time. She looked at him steadily. But the fire you used on the shade, that felt like it could do more than a shade, Harry said. Yes. He nodded once. The night the vanguard came, the moon was full, which Arya had always thought was something people invented to make night attacks sound more dramatic and had eventually accepted was simply a practical reality of pre-electric outdoor operations. Full moon meant visibility in both directions. She was on the south wall when she saw the first movement at the tree line, a figure, cloaked, coming through the trees at a distance that should have been outside visual range and wasn't because she'd been watching for exactly this in exactly this direction for 2 days. John, she said, not loud. He was off the cottage roof in 4 seconds. He'd been up there, which she told him was a terrible watch position and he'd pointed out gave him a clear sight line to all 4 approaches, and they'd had the argument 3 times this week, and he'd been right, and she'd accepted this without saying so. Harry was already outside. He'd known before either of them, the bond had woken him, she suspected. Nymeria's ghost was in the air, invisible against the dark sky but present, felt. There were 9 of them. More than she'd expected, she'd predicted 6, had planned for 8, had 9. They came from 3 directions, coordinated, and they were good, she gave them that. They moved with the precise unhurried confidence of trained people who believed in their numbers and their plan. Mulciber was at the center of the south approach. He stopped when he saw Harry standing in the yard. Not Arya, not John, Harry, standing in the yard alone, apparently alone, in the moonlight with no apparent weapon and no apparent concern. He was wearing his plain dark clothing and his feet were placed the way they were placed when he was ready, and he was looking at Mulciber with the expression he developed over 5 years of being looked at by people who wanted things from him, the one that gave nothing away and cost the looker something. Harry Potter, Mulciber said. He had a good voice, she'd give him that. Low, even, certain without being aggressive. The voice of someone who had talked people into things many times. We've been looking for you for a long time. I know, Harry said. I'd like to talk to you. My guardian said that's usually what people say right before they try something else. A beat. Your guardian. Mulciber looked around the yard. I'd rather speak with you directly. You are, Harry said. Mulciber's eyes moved, the slight movement of the experienced operator running a calculation. He was looking for Arya and John, who were not visible because they were very good at not being visible. He was also, she noticed, looking for the dragon. Nothing showed above the cottage. The sky was clear. What I want to offer you, Mulciber said, and she heard the shift in him, the decision to try the honest version, which was interesting, is protection. The world you're about to walk into is going to want to use you. Dumbledore wants to use you as a weapon against Voldemort. The Ministry wants to use you as a symbol. There are others who want things I won't describe to a 10-year-old. He paused. I want to offer you something they won't. I want to offer you a place where your power serves you first. And you second, Harry said. Mulciber looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not the controlled adjustment of before, something more genuine, a man encountering a version of the conversation he hadn't prepared for. I lost people, he said. To Voldemort. 3 family members. And then I lost more of them to the people who were supposed to stop Voldemort but cared more about their own power than the people they were supposed to protect. His voice had gone quieter. I'm not a good man. I know that. But I'm an honest one. And what I'm saying is true. I believe you, Harry said. Mulciber waited. I believe you lost people, Harry said. I believe the world failed them. I believe you built something because you decided power was the only real protection. He paused. I believe all of it, and it doesn't change anything, because building the thing you hated because you decided you'd rather be the thing that frightens people than the person it frightens, that's not protection. That's just moving to the other side of the same problem. The yard was very quiet. You're 10 years old, Mulciber said, and there was something in it that was almost wonder, almost grief. Yes, Harry said. And you came to my home at night with 8 people. So. And then the world moved. The 8 others had been circling the ward line, and the moment they crossed it, the moment the first of them decided the talking was over and committed to the approach, Arya was moving. She came from the eastern shadow with needle in her hand, not steel needle, no, the Valyrian work she'd built into her blade over 5 years, the fire edge that the gates had given her hands the capacity to make. It wasn't fire exactly. It was the memory of fire, made actual, running the length of the blade in deep gold. She took the first one at the wrist, fast and economical, and he dropped his wand and his composure simultaneously. Jon came from the north side with ghosts coloring, which was what she called it, the way he moved in darkness, absorbed by it, using it, the old ranging habits of the wall making him precisely as visible as he chose to be. He had 2 of them engaged before they finished processing what was happening. Harry raised his hand. The fire came the way it came now, effortless, immediate, the breathing thing. Not at the people, Harry never aimed at the people directly, which was a choice she'd watched him make and confirmed once, I can deal with the magic without dealing with the person. He targeted their wands, their cast spells, the active magic in the air between them. The Valyrian fire hit their curses mid-flight and consumed them. 3 of Mulciber's 8 were on the ground, disarmed, inside 20 seconds. The remaining 5 stopped. Mulciber was still standing in the center of the yard, looking at Harry, and above them the moon lit everything silver and gold, and Nymeria's ghost descended from the dark sky like a decision already made. She didn't breathe fire. She landed on the cottage roof, massive and luminous, and spread her wings once to their full span, the span that crossed the yard side to side with room to spare, and closed them again, and looked at Mulciber with eyes like molten gold. The silence was comprehensive. Mulciber looked at the dragon. Then at Harry. Then at the 3 of his people on the ground, and the 5 standing still, and Arya with the fire-edge blade, and Jon with the stillness that was its own kind of threat. I didn't know about the dragon, he said, quietly. Not to Harry. To himself. Most people don't, Harry said. We're careful. She's real, Mulciber said. A real Valyrian, yes. A long pause. What are you? Mulciber asked, and it was the first time he'd asked a real question. The previous ones had been positions, this was genuine inquiry. I'm figuring that out, Harry said. But I know what I'm not. I'm not yours. I'm not Dumbledore's. I'm not the Ministry's, and I'm not Voldemort's. He met Mulciber's eyes. I'm going to ask you to leave. Your people who are on the ground aren't seriously hurt. You should check that and then go. Mulciber looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in the man's face that she watched with care. He was recalculating, not tactically, which was over, but something more fundamental. He'd come with a plan built on a model of Harry Potter that was constructed from old information and wishful thinking. The model had been comprehensively replaced by the reality, and the reality was a 10-year-old in a moonlit yard with fire in his hands and a dragon on his roof, flanked by 2 people who moved like violence made patient, telling him to leave. Mulciber picked up his 2 colleagues with the 3rd. He didn't draw his wand again. He looked at Harry once more, at the end, and the look had a different quality from all the others, the quality of a man storing something carefully in a part of his mind he returned to when he needed to revise his understanding of the world. Then he walked out of the yard and took his people with him and didn't look back. When they were gone, the night settled back into itself. Nymeria's ghost stayed on the roof. John kicked the grass back up where feet had pressed it down, a small automatic gesture of restoring things. Arya sheathed her blade and felt the fire edge recede and looked at her hands for a moment before looking at Harry. Harry was looking at the tree line where Mulciber had disappeared. "He'll come back," John said. "Not the same way," Harry said. "He'll think first. Next time he'll ask before he comes." "You believe that?" Harry turned back. He asked real questions at the end. People who ask real questions are reconsidering. You don't reconsider things you're certain about. He paused. He might actually want what he said he wants. Protection. He just wanted it arranged wrong. "You have a lot of sympathy for a man who just came at you with 8 people," Arya said. "I have a lot of understanding," Harry corrected, gently. "That's different." She looked at him. He was 10 years old and had just handled a coordinated night assault on his home with the composure of someone twice his age and the mercy of someone who had thought carefully about the difference between defeating a threat and destroying a person. She thought about Sirio's question, the god of death, and thought about her answer, and thought about the answer Harry would give, and thought they were different answers and that both of them were right. Inside, she put the school letters on the table again. Harry sat across from her. Nymeria's ghost came through the window with the deliberate compression she used for doorways, landed on the table, knocked the Hogwarts letter onto the floor, and settled there with her tail wrapped around the remaining stack. Harry looked at the stack. "Wagadu," he said. "Tell me why." "Okafor is there. Ancient theory, which I need if I'm going to understand the bond and what it can do. It's in Africa, which is far enough from the primary problems here that I can operate without constant interference. And it's not Hogwarts." He looked at her. "Not Hogwarts means not Dumbledore's direct sphere. It means I arrive in the wizarding world on my own terms, at a place that isn't already organized around a plan for me." "You'd be away," she said. "From us." "I'd come home," he said simply, like it wasn't a question. She looked at John. John was looking at the fire with his "I've already decided something and I'm waiting for the conversation to arrive where I am" expression. "We come too," John said. "We find something near Wagadu. Consult with Okafor. Harry goes to school," he said the word with the careful inflection of someone treating a concept with appropriate respect despite personal reservations. "And we're close enough to not be gone." "You don't have to," Harry started. "We come too," Arya said. Harry looked at her for a moment. The gold of the bond light was gone from his eyes, just the green now, just 10-year-old Harry with his bird's nest hair and the scar and the broken then fixed glasses. They'd gotten him new ones 2 years ago, wire-framed, better suited to his face. He looked like himself. Like the person he'd been becoming the whole time. "Okay," he said. Nymeria's ghost knocked the Wagadu letter off the remaining stack and looked up at Harry as though she had done something clever. Harry laughed. It was a real laugh, full, unguarded, the laugh of a 10-year-old who didn't have to be careful about it anymore. Arya let herself smile, which was rarer than she made it look and therefore worth more. Outside the window, the Highland night was as dark and cold as it had always been. The loch sat quiet. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. Tomorrow they'd start planning. Tonight they were home, all 3 of them plus a dragon who thought she was clever, and the fire was warm, and the letters were decided. Chapter 6, Dragon Lord. They left Scotland on a morning that couldn't decide between rain and not rain, which felt appropriate. The cottage had been their home for 4 years, which was longer than Harry had lived anywhere else and longer than either Arya or John had stayed in one place since the Gates had started moving them. Leaving it had the weight of something real. Harry walked through every room once before they locked it, not sentimentally, just deliberately, the way he did things he wanted to remember clearly. He stood in his room with the egg shells on the windowsill and the knife marks on the doorframe where Arya had been recording his height every 6 months, and he looked at it all with the steady attention of someone filing it somewhere it would keep. Then he picked up the egg shells, wrapped them carefully in cloth, and put them in his pack. Nymeria's ghost waited outside, already in her travel configuration, compact, wings tight, anchored to Harry's presence in a way that made her move with him like a shadow with opinions. She'd grown again over the summer. She was now the size of a draft horse, maybe larger, with a wingspan that needed real sky to express itself, and the gold veins had spread from her neck and wing joints to cover more of her body, running in intricate patterns that shifted when the light hit them differently. In full sun she was extraordinary. In the Scottish grey she was simply immense and black and present. Okafor had arranged the Valyrian gate coordinates for Uganda 3 weeks ahead of their departure. The gate would open near the Lake Victoria shore at a site Okafor knew, a Valyrian remnant, the last functioning long-distance gate on the continent, which had been dormant until Okafor had spent 6 months coaxing it back to something usable using methods she described in a letter to Arya that ran to 12 pages and referenced 40 sources. Arya had read it twice, understood about 70% of it, and felt the remaining 30% somewhere beneath comprehension in the place where her Valyrian work lived. The gate opened on schedule. Jon went through first, which he always did, old habits of going ahead into uncertain ground, and Arya went last, which she always did, old habits of making sure there was nothing behind them worth worrying about. Harry went through with Nymeria's ghost folded close and came out the other side into heat and light and the smell of water so large it behaved like a sea. Lake Victoria stretched out before them, enormous and silver blue under a sky that was doing completely different things with the concept of daylight than Scotland had ever managed. The air was warm and heavy and full of sounds that were entirely different from Highland sounds, birds with no equivalents in the north, insects in their thousands, the water on the shore moving with a different rhythm. Harry stopped and breathed it in and something happened in his face that she'd seen before, the window unlatching thing, the expansion of the shoulders, the tilt of the chin upward. The same thing that had happened when they'd first arrived in the Highlands. The same thing that happened when he found himself somewhere that was large enough to contain what he was becoming. Nymeria's ghost spread her wings fully for the first time since morning and launched herself into the African sky with a sound like a struck sail, climbing in a long spiral that took her through a bank of cloud and out the other side, and the sound she made from up there was the free sound, the sound that was just the dragon being the dragon with nothing between her and the sky. "She likes it," Jon said. "She's been waiting to do that since Inverness," Harry said, watching her. Okafor met them at the lakeshore with a truck, which she drove with the confidence of someone who trusted her own reflexes more than she trusted the road. She brought them to a property 40 minutes from Wagadu's campus, a house considerably larger than the Highland cottage, with a walled yard and an open sky section in the center big enough for Nymeria's ghost to land in. Okafor had arranged it with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this for longer than she'd admitted. "How long have you been setting this up?" Arya asked, walking through the property. 18 months, Okafor said, without embarrassment. Since it became clear the letters were coming and that Harry needed options that weren't already someone else's plan. "You planned it without telling us." "I planned the option. You've been exercising it freely." She looked at Arya with the frank directness that was her default. "I do know the difference." Arya looked at her for a moment and decided this was true and moved on. Harry started at Wagadu 2 weeks after they arrived. The school was built into a mountainside in the Rwenzori Range, which were called the Mountains of the Moon and deserved the name, cloud-wrapped, high, cold in a way that was entirely unlike Highland cold, sharper and thinner and more absolute. The buildings followed the mountain's contours rather than imposing on them, connected by paths and bridges and in some places by nothing physical at all, just the understanding that you moved from here to there and the mountain accommodated. It was the oldest magical school in the world. It felt like it. The walls had the quality Arya associated with Valyrian sites, the sense of a structure that had been in active conversation with time long enough to develop opinions about it. The students were from 30 different countries and learned through a methodology that bore almost no resemblance to the wand and incantation approach of European magical schools. Wagadu magic was older than that, more fundamental, operating at the level of intention and understanding rather than gesture and word. Harry took to it immediately and completely, in the way he took to things that matched some internal architecture he'd already been building. He also took to the other students. Arya had wondered about this, Harry's social experience prior to Wagadu was essentially limited to her, John, Okafor, and a handful of people who'd come to the Highland cottage with agendas. She'd watched him be excellent at reading people and excellent at the measured calibration of trust, and she'd wondered if 5 years of that had made him too careful for ordinary friendship. Too watchful. It hadn't. It had made him precise about it, which was different from cautious. He didn't friend everyone and he didn't perform friendship for social utility. He found 2 people in his first month, a girl from Nigeria named Adana who had a laugh like a building falling down and a way with elemental magic that made the air around her behave differently, and a boy from Madagascar named Remy whose specific magical gift was memory so precise that he could reproduce any spell he'd seen once, from any angle. They were both 10 and both exceptional and both, Arya noted when she met them, entirely unintimidated by Harry. Which was the point? Which was why Harry had picked them. Nymeria's ghost was the subject of considerable discussion at Wagadu. The school had encountered magical creatures before, it sat in some of the most magically dense terrain on the continent, but a living, bonded Valyrian dragon was something none of the staff had seen and most of the faculty had categorized as extinct. The headmistress, a woman named Ajoa Asante who had the bearing of someone who had dealt with extraordinary things for long enough to have developed a very high threshold for it, came to meet Harry and the dragon in his 3rd week with 2 senior faculty members and looked at Nymeria's ghost for a full minute without speaking. Then she looked at Harry. "You bonded her," she said. "She bonded me," Harry said. "There's a difference." Asante looked at him with the same expression most people settled on when Harry corrected their framing, the expression of someone absorbing the correction and deciding it mattered. "How old were you when it happened?" 5 when I found the egg. 7 when she hatched. And the bond has been integrating since. Yes. Asante looked at the dragon once more. Nymeria's ghost looked back with her gold eyes, entirely without performance, the way she looked at most things, direct, measuring, present. "The bond light," Asante said, meaning the gold that surfaced in Harry's eyes when the connection was fully active. "It's stable." "Always," Harry said. "We'll need to accommodate her on campus," Asante said. "There's a plateau on the eastern face that isn't used. Open sky, shelter on 3 sides." She said it as though this was a straightforward logistical matter rather than the unprecedented accommodation of a mythological creature, which Arya appreciated. "She'll want to check it herself," Harry said. "Of course." He told the dragon, and the dragon flew to the eastern plateau and circled it twice and came back and settled on Harry's shoulders in the compact mode and made the acceptance sound. Harry looked at Asante. "It's good." Asante nodded once and went back to running her school. Arya liked her immediately and filed the feeling away. The real education, Arya knew, wasn't only what happened in Wagadu's classes. It was the accumulation of everything Harry had been building since the Highland cottage, now brought into contact with formal structure and other exceptional young minds and ancient institutional knowledge. She could see it compounding. Each week he came home to the lakeside house with something new not just in knowledge but in integration, the way separate systems learn to talk to each other. His magic and the bond had been integrating for 3 years. Now his formal education was integrating with both of them. She watched it happen with the feeling she always had watching Harry, the feeling of standing near something that was becoming itself completely, and being glad she'd been close enough to see it. She also watched the other thing. The thing she'd been watching for months without saying. The scar. Harry had always been aware of it, had known, since before he was old enough to understand the full implications, that there was something in it that wasn't his. He'd felt Voldemort's presence in it like a splinter, constant, located, something his attention moved over and moved on from. In Scotland it had been dormant, the Highland wards, combined with the distance from Britain's concentrated magical history, had quieted it. In Uganda, closer to the Valyrian site that powered their gate, closer to the ancient magic in the mountain bones of the Rwenzorus, it was louder. She knew because of the way he touched it sometimes, the same 2-finger press she'd seen him use since he was 7. Checking. Taking its measure. She knew because of the way Nymeria's ghost reacted to it, the specific low sound, not the threat sound and not the acceptance sound but a third sound, private, directed at Harry alone, the sound of the bond paying attention to something inside the person it was bonded to. She knew because Okafor had been working on the theory for 2 years and had told her, 6 weeks ago, that she thought it was ready to try. Not safe, exactly, there was no precedent, no certain outcome, no way to know whether the attempt would work or work incorrectly or fail in a way that had consequences. But ready in the sense of, the pieces were in place, the understanding was sufficient, the fire was developed enough. She hadn't said anything to Harry yet. She said it on a Saturday afternoon in November, 4 months into his first term, when he'd come home from school and eaten lunch and was sitting in the yard with the dragon and his homework, working through a problem in ancient magical theory that he kept arguing with under his breath. The light was good, the yard was warm, and she sat down across from him and said, "Okafor thinks the scar is ready." Harry looked up. He put the homework down. "Ready for what specifically?" he said, and she could tell from the absence of surprise that he'd been thinking about it too, that the two-finger press was its own version of readiness. "To try to burn it out," she said. "The fragment. The piece of Voldemort." She looked at him directly. "She thinks the fire is strong enough and integrated enough to target it without," she paused. "Without the targeting being imprecise." He understood what she meant. "Without burning the wrong thing." He was quiet for a long moment. The dragon had lifted her head from the yard and was looking at him with the focused gold of full bond attention. "If it works," he said, "Voldemort can't feel me through it anymore." "Yes. And if there is a Horcrux in there, if there is," she said, "which I believe there is and which Dumbledore confirmed without confirming when I asked him directly 2 years ago, if there is, destroying it is the best thing that could happen. For you and for the larger problem." "Dumbledore's plan needs it to stay," Harry said. "Dumbledore's plan needs it to stay until Voldemort is killed in the right sequence," she agreed. "But Dumbledore's plan was written assuming he had a specific version of you to work with. He doesn't." She met his eyes. "You're not required to be convenient for his plan." Harry looked at the scar. Touched it with 2 fingers, the old habit. "Does it hurt?" "Okafor doesn't know." She said it shouldn't. "She said it will feel like fire," Harry said. "Yes." He lowered his hand and looked at the dragon. They had one of their private exchanges, the bond running between them, information and feeling in something that wasn't language but functioned like it. The dragon made the contained fire sound and touched Harry's face briefly with her muzzle. "I want to do it," he said. "I know. Today." She looked at the homework on the ground beside him. "Finish your theory problem first." He picked it up. She watched him argue with it for another 20 minutes until he'd resolved it to his satisfaction, then he set it aside and looked at the dragon and then at her. "Today," he said. She went inside and told John and called Okafor through the communication stone, and they assembled in the large central room of the lakeside house, all 4 of them, plus the dragon, who took up a significant portion of the floor and managed this without apology. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell in long warm bars across the floor. Okafor laid out what she knew in the compact, honest way she presented things, what the theory said, what the limits of the theory were, what she expected and what she didn't know. Harry listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "How do I direct it?" "The scar is already the target. The fire knows where its opposite is, dark and fire recognize each other. You don't direct it at the scar, you direct it through yourself and let it find the fragment." She paused. "The hardest part will be not flinching. If the fire hesitates mid-process, it won't," Harry said. Okafor looked at him. "You're very certain." "The fire doesn't hesitate," he said. "It hasn't since Nymeria's ghost and I finished integrating. It's the part of me that doesn't second-guess." He said it without arrogance, just as a property of the thing, a description of how it worked. "All right," Okafor said. Harry looked at John. John looked back at him with the wall face, which was not impassivity, it was the face of someone who was very present and not showing how present they were, because showing it would add weight to something that needed to be light. He gave one nod. Harry looked at Arya. She'd been watching him the whole time with the attention she brought to the things that mattered completely. 10 years old. 5 years from the cupboard under the stairs. Dragon Lord in the making, trained to move and fight and think and choose, trained to trust his own hands and his own fire and his own judgment. The person the Dursleys had tried to diminish down into nothing, had tried to produce a small frightened grateful manageable version of, had tried to make believe he was a burden and an inconvenience and a punishment to be endured. She looked at him and thought about all of it. Thought about the bench in the park in the November grey and are you going to put me back? Thought about the Highland cottage and the candle going up and coming down. Thought about the practice sticks and the sword's work and the years of building something solid enough to stand on. She gave him the same nod John had. Harry sat cross-legged on the floor and Nymeria's ghost settled behind him, her chest against his back, her wings half spread in the available space, her head over his shoulder. The gold of their shared veins ran in parallel, his in his hands and throat, hers along her neck and chest, the same pattern, the same pulse, the two halves of the same system. He closed his eyes. The fire came the way it came now, breathing, immediate, the thing that was just there. She felt it before she saw it, the familiar pressure change of Harry's significant magic, the air becoming more present. Then the gold light rose in him, at his hands first, spreading up his arms, and Nymeria's ghost deepened behind him, her own veins going from gold to white gold, the center of fire color, feeding into the bond and being fed by it. For 30 seconds nothing else happened. Then Harry's face changed. Not pain exactly, she'd been watching for pain and was watching for it now. What happened was more complex than pain. His brow drew in and his jaw tightened and the expression was the expression of someone reaching into themselves and finding a place they'd always known was wrong and wrapping something around it, the way you wrapped a hand around a splinter before you pulled it. The fire in him intensified. Not dramatic, not explosive, intense, the way a forge was intense, contained, directional, everything focused on one thing. The gold light moved from his hands up toward his face and she watched it converge on the scar. The scar went dark. It had always been red-pink, the livid mark of the curse that had left it. It went dark the way things went dark when fire was inside them rather than outside, the color of iron before it went red, the color of wood just before it caught. She heard Okafor make a sound beside her, quiet, professional, the sound of someone witnessing something they'd theorized and are watching become real. Harry made a sound. Once. A single sharp exhale that was not a cry and not nothing, somewhere between them, the sound of someone completing a very hard movement all the way through rather than stopping short of it. The dark in the scar pulsed once. Then the fire came through it. The gold light broke through the scar's darkness the way dawn broke through the last of the night, not gradually, not dramatically, just the moment when more light than dark existed and the balance tipped and the dark was done. There was a sound, very brief, that she couldn't describe, not the shade sound from the lock, not mechanical, something more fundamental, the sound of something that had been holding a shape releasing it. The scar went pale. Harry exhaled again, long, slow, the exhale of someone finishing. The gold light in his hands and arms subsided. Nymeria's ghost made the sound she made when something was resolved, the settling sound, and pressed her muzzle against Harry's cheek and stayed there. Harry opened his eyes. They were fully gold for longer than usual, 6, 7 seconds, the bond light fading slowly before the green came back. He pressed 2 fingers to his forehead, the old habit, but differently this time. Not checking. Just touching. It's gone, he said. Okafor was already moving toward him, her hands up in the manner of someone running a diagnostic, reading the magical signature. She went through it thoroughly and quickly. Then she sat back on her heels. It's gone, she confirmed. Her voice had the specific quality of a scholar witnessing something they'll be writing about for the rest of their career. The Horcrux fragment is destroyed. The scar, she looked at it. The scar is still there. But it's clean. It's just a scar. Like ghosts, Harry said. John made the sound again, the short real one, and turned it into clearing his throat, which fooled no one. He can't feel you anymore, Arya said. No. Harry tested it, she could tell, the two-finger press, but this time looking inward rather than monitoring. There's nothing. It's quiet. He said quiet the way people said words for things they'd wanted for a long time and had stopped expecting. It's been making noise since I can remember. I didn't know it was noise until it stopped. A silence. How do you feel? John asked. Harry thought about it in the real way, the full inventory, not the automatic fine. Lighter, he said. Then, looking at the dragon, she's pleased with herself. She should be, Okafor said. Nymeria's ghost had in fact arranged herself with the particular geometry of satisfaction, fully extended, chest up, head high, the way she sat when she'd done something she thought deserved acknowledgement. Harry leaned back against her side and she wrapped her tail around him once, a small gesture that was entirely dragon and entirely affectionate. It was dark by the time Dumbledore arrived. He came through the gate, she'd expected him to, had known that the destruction of a Horcrux fragment would register across the magical world like a bell rung in an empty room. She was sitting on the steps of the house when she heard the gate open and watched him come across the yard in the Uganda evening, robes the deep blue of the darkening sky, walking with the unhurried authority of someone who had decided to be calm about this and was maintaining the decision under pressure. He stopped in the yard and looked at her. The Horcrux, he said. Gone, she said. A long pause. You knew. I suspected for 3 years. You confirmed it without confirming it 2 years ago when I asked you a specific question about the scar and you gave me a general answer. He was quiet with that. There's a sequence, he said. The Horcruxes need to be destroyed we'll destroy them, Arya said. Or Harry will. Or both. The sequence is yours, not his. If Voldemort senses the loss, Voldemort can't sense Harry anymore. That connection is gone. She looked at him steadily. Which changes the calculation significantly. In Harry's favor. Dumbledore stood in the yard and looked at the house and at the light in the windows and at the place in the air where Nymeria's ghost was visible as a large darkness against the stars. He had the expression of a man revising very large plans under time pressure, which she imagined was an unfamiliar feeling for someone who had always been the most senior planner in any room. He's 10 years old, Dumbledore said. I know. What you've made of him is, he stopped. Started again. What he's become is not what I expected. No, she agreed. He's more. Yes. I had a plan, I know you did, she said, and she said it without cruelty, because it wasn't about cruelty. And parts of your plan are right. He does have to face Voldemort eventually. The prophecy may be real. There is a fight coming. She met his eyes. But he won't face it small. He won't face it grateful and shaped and manageable. He'll face it as what he is. She paused. And what he is better than what you planned. Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. He was doing the thing she'd first seen him do in the Highland Yard, genuinely seeing something, without the management filter, without the careful presentation of acceptable emotions. He looked tired, she thought. Not old, he'd always been old, but tired in the way of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and had just been told they could put some of it down. May I see him? He asked. She considered for a moment. Then stood and opened the door. Harry was inside at the table with John and Okafor, the theory homework out again because apparently resolving a multi-year dark magical problem didn't exempt you from academic deadlines. Nymeria's ghost was on the floor beside him. The lamp on the table made everything warm and domestic in a way that Arya thought, somewhat fiercely, was entirely his. Harry looked up when Dumbledore came in. His eyes were green. Just green. The scar on his forehead was pale and still. Dumbledore looked at him. The grief and relief and something else expression that had been on his face in the Highland yard was back, older now, worked by the 5 years between then and this. "Harry," he said. "Dumbledore," Harry said. "I owe you, you don't owe me anything," Harry said, with the particular kindness that was his specific version of it, not soft, not indulgent, clear. "You made choices you thought were right. Some of them were wrong. I'm not going to forgive the cupboard on a Tuesday evening because you came to Uganda. But I'm not carrying it either." He looked at the old man directly. "What I want from you is the truth. All of it. What you know about the remaining Horcruxes. What the prophecy says exactly. What Voldemort's current state is. All of it. No sequence, no managed disclosure, no giving me the parts you've decided I need." Dumbledore was quiet. "I'll work with you," Harry said. "But it's working with. Not working for. Not working inside your plan." He held the old man's gaze. "Are those terms acceptable?" A long silence. John was looking at his hands. Okafor was looking at Dumbledore with scholarly attention. Arya was watching Harry the way she watched Harry, with the full attention of someone who was genuinely seeing, every time, what was in front of them. "Yes," Dumbledore said. He sat down. And he told Harry everything. All of it, the Horcruxes by name and location, as many as he knew. The prophecy in full, not summarized, the exact words. The state of Voldemort's rebuilding, which was further along than Dumbledore had been comfortable saying previously and which Harry absorbed without visible alarm. The things Dumbledore had done and the reasons, laid out without the framing softened, because Harry had asked for the truth and Dumbledore, Arya thought, was capable of it when someone asked clearly enough. Harry listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them going to the gap between what Dumbledore said and what it implied. He made 2 notes in the margin of his theory homework, which he'd given up on completing that night. Nymeria's ghost tracked the conversation with gold eyes, and the bond that ran between her and Harry was quiet and active and present, the 2 of them together in the room like a single thing that took up more than its component parts. When Dumbledore finished, Harry looked at the notes he'd made. "The locket," he said. "You said you think it's in Britain. That's where we'd start." "Harry, when I'm ready," Harry said. "Not now. I'm 10. I have school." He said it with complete seriousness. "But I want to know the locations so we can think about them. And I want Arya and John involved in whatever approach we develop." He looked at Dumbledore. "Those aren't negotiations. They're how it works." Dumbledore looked at the boy across the table and Arya watched him do the thing she'd been watching him slowly learn to do over 5 years of contact, see Harry as he actually was, rather than as the thing his plan had required. He was good at planning and deeply certain of his own rightness and capable of extraordinary cruelty in service of genuine love. He was also, she thought, capable of revision. She'd decided this about him slowly and was still deciding. "All right," Dumbledore said. "Yes." Later, after Dumbledore had gone back through the gate and Okafor had gone home and John had made food and they'd all eaten without ceremony, Harry went out into the yard with the dragon and Arya followed and they sat on the low wall while Nymeria's ghost stretched herself in the open sky section of the yard, wings wide, looking up at the stars. The Uganda night was enormous. The stars here were different than in Scotland, more of them, lower, brighter, the sky unpolluted by anything. The mountains of the moon were visible to the north as dark shapes against the star field. "How does it feel?" Arya asked. She was asking about the scar but also about everything, the whole day, the whole 5 years. Harry thought about it with the care he gave real questions. "Like I know where I'm going," he said. "Not the details. Not the whole path. But the direction." He looked at the dragon, who had folded her wings and was watching them with her gold eyes. "She feels it too. Like we're pointed at something." "You are." "It's not frightening," he said. "No. No." He looked at her. Is that strange? She thought about 17-year-old Arya on Privet Drive, standing outside a house in the grey November dark, following the sound of a child crying because something in her was still oriented toward things that needed righting. Thought about the feeling of the cold morning in the park with a 5-year-old asleep against John's arm. Thought about the years of building something, the footwork and the sword work and the magic and the morning forms and the honest conversations and the choice to stay and stay and stay. No, she said. It's not strange. Harry leaned back on the wall and looked at the stars. I want to be good at it, he said. Not just powerful. Good. He said it with the same certainty he used for things he decided were non-negotiable. The fire, the bond, all of it, I want to use it the right way. Not Dumbledore's right way, not Mulciber's right way. He paused. Mine. You will be, Arya said. How do you know? She looked at him, this 10-year-old boy who had been building himself deliberately for 5 years, who had stood in a moonlit yard and spoken to a threat with mercy and fought when fighting was the language required and asked real questions and burned out the thing in his own scar because he'd decided it was time. Who had named a dragon for the 2 people he'd decided to trust and had never once, in 5 years, given either of them reason to doubt that trust was right. Because you asked the question, she said. People who don't care about being good don't ask whether they will be. Harry considered this. Then nodded, the single decisive nod. Nymeria's ghost made the contained fire sound and spread her wings once and folded them, the way she did when she was settling into a long watch. Above the yard the stars went on being extraordinary. The lake was a mile away and invisible but present, the smell of water so large it had its own weather. John appeared in the doorway with 2 cups. He handed one to Arya, sat on the wall on Harry's other side, and looked at the stars without feeling the need to comment on them. The 3 of them sat in the Uganda night and the dragon watched over them, and there was nothing threatening the yard, and there was nothing in the scar, and the Horcruxes were a problem for a future that hadn't arrived yet, and Voldemort was a problem for a future that hadn't arrived yet, and the whole world with its plans and prophecies and institutionalized certainties was a problem for a future that hadn't arrived yet. Right now there was the lake smell and the star field and the warmth of 2 people who had chosen this and kept choosing it, and a 10-year-old dragon lord who wasn't afraid of anything because he had been taught, carefully and deliberately, over the best 5 years of his life, that fear was not the appropriate response to his own power. He would walk into the fights when they came. He would walk in as himself, the thing the cupboard had tried to diminish, the thing the Dursleys had tried to make small, the thing Dumbledore had tried to shape and Mulciber had tried to own and Voldemort had tried to mark and define. All of them had failed the same failure. They'd assumed he was a resource rather than a person, a symbol rather than a self, a piece in their version of the story rather than the center of his own. He was the center of his own. He was Harry. He was the boy from the cupboard and the boy from the Highland cottage and the boy who named a dragon for the people he loved. He was a dragon lord of Stark blood and Valyrian fire and he was 10 years old and he was just beginning. The night went on. The fire in Nymeria's ghost's veins pulsed slow and gold. The stars looked down at all of it and said nothing, the way stars did, because they were old enough to know that some things didn't need commentary. They just needed to be seen.